Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel and welcome to my Omnibus series. I've got so many of these omnibuses that are going to come out so that you'll be able to listen to an hour's worth of stories, which I know you're going to love. You know, the thing is that telling stories is such a fine art, and it's something that was practiced hundreds of years ago when people didn't have the technology that we have today. And everyone would gather around the fire and listen to a wonderful story. And also, what is so wonderful about a story is that personally, I think it is the best way to go to sleep. Every night when I go to bed, I always listen to stories. And that's something that parents used to do with their children. It's something that they still do with their children. There's nothing better than a good story. And so I hope you're going to enjoy this series. And before we start, I just want to say, do subscribe to my channel because you don't want to miss out on anything. Because I'm in for the long haul and I want to make sure that you get the most stunning stories to go to bed with at night or to listen to when you want to be one of those people sitting beside the fire and listening. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and let's get started. I hope you're going to enjoy the omnibus.
Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, the year was 1945. I was 8 years old at the time. I was being raised by two self-sacrificing wonderful women, my mother and my grandmother, in the Lexington area of the bluegrass state of Kentucky. Suffice to say, regretfully, there were no male role models in my young life, as my mother was estranged from my father, while my grandfather was by then long since deceased, as he had died in his late 30s a long time ago. My mother was a librarian who worked in the local town. She was an ardent book lover who revelled in her job. She enjoyed organising book clubs and audio readings for children and adults alike. For those were the days when social media had not arrived on the scene, so for entertainment purposes, people always gravitated to the storytelling or reading at the local library. So it really was a no-brainer that my grandmother would take me under her charge while my mother was at work. The arrangement suited her well. The three of us lived together very cosily in an idyllic Georgian-style country cottage on a large horse farm that in previous years had been owned by my grandparents, but my grandmother had sold the farm before I was even born. Subsequently, she'd been allowed to keep the charming, whimsical cottage on the grounds for herself, as agreed upon by the new owners. My grandmother loved to surround herself with horses. She adored their gentle, intelligent natures, so living apart from them was a nonsensical idea. She boarded her bay and black horse Cleopatra on the farm so that she could ride her in the open countryside whenever she wished. The sight of the graceful, majestic, lofty silhouettes of the horses frolicking and cantering across the fields brought her a great measure of comfort. Furthermore, the smell of hay, leather and tack were exceedingly agreeable to her. They reminded her of warm summer days trotting in the open sunshine, the wind blowing against her cheeks, with her legs pressed against the saddle, while she bobbed up and down on the horse's glistening back, through pretty sparkling meadows bespeckled with bright colourful flowers, while listening to the tweets, trills and warbles of the birds in the valley. The old-world, poetic but stylish-looking cottage looked like something you'd expect to see in the Scottish Highlands. It was affectionately called Whispering Hills Cottage, situated at the far right-hand side of the horse farm, well away from the main house, where a single fork in the asphalt road, marked with a sign labelled Whistling Hills Cottage, along with a pointed arrow, led directly to my grandmother's enchanting abode, that blended so seamlessly into the environment. It was as pretty as a picture, a white brick building with a wholesome simplicity about it that was remarkably endearing. It possessed sash windows, a wraparound porch, a grey slate roof that overlooked the most idyllic, awe-inspiring views over a silvery lake that was heavily flanked by a pristine, statuesque wood grove that opened up into bounteous horse-riding trails sprawling over a vast distance. My grandmother loved nothing better than to sit back on the wraparound porch in her rocking chair with her knitting, while she watched a plethora of bird life, along with ducks and their ducklings, not to mention the indigenous animals that visited the lake regularly for a drink. She had seen a family of raccoons, a handful of deers, and even a couple of mountain lions frequent the lake consistently. There were times when my grandmother was so busy that that she'd call Bertha, the lady of the forest, to take care of me. I'm not sure that even my mother knew about this cosy convivial arrangement. It was probably a good thing she didn't. My grandmother would whistle, and then out of the woods this tall, hairy female creature would emerge. It's amazing how when you're 8 years old, you accept the unusual and the outlandish as if it's the most natural, normal thing in the entire world. The guileless, unassuming Bertha did not look like my mother's regular friends. For a start, she never wore clothes. Her whole body was covered in long, flowing dark hair. But for the first time I met her, and from that moment, I liked her, for there was something so wholesome, salutary, organic, and reassuring about her, possibly because she was so unsophisticated, unpretentious, and ingenious. I remember she was taller than our front door, easily as wide, with overlong arms and a pyramid-shaped head that flowed seamlessly into her shoulders. She was robust, but it was her fresh, hairless face that was remarkably human, while her bear-like brown eyes always twinkled with merriment. I didn't really consider Bertha not to be human. In my eyes she was a very big, unpolished, unvarnished, and native forest lady that was covered in hair. That was the only thing that set her apart from other human beings. My grandmother would say to me, "You go and play with Bertha. Grammy's got lots of things she needs to do." Bertha knew instinctively that my grandmother wanted her to babysit me. She was absolutely delighted to oblige. She gave my Gram an agreeable nod, while my Gram in return gave her an affectionate nudge. Bertha would lower her Titanic-sized powerful body that rippled with muscle into a low squatting position so that I could easily climb onto her substantial-sized shoulders. Then she would hold my legs down with her overlong arms and would glide with me perched on her shoulders into the heart of the woods. I would be giggling, "Look at me, Grammy! Look at me! I'm on top of the world! I'm on top of the world! Look at me, Grammy!" I would wave at my Grammy while she'd watch us riding into the woods with a big smile on her face. "Have a nice time, sweetheart," she'd call out while she waved. Even at that young age, I realised that riding Bertha was unorthodox and different, poles apart from riding a horse, as I'd ridden a horse on the farm many times before. Bertha almost floated with me seated on her shoulders. I never experienced those jiggling up and down jolts that you invariably experience on the back of a horse. Bertha would take me into a part of the woods well away from any hiking trails to a secret area where many branches had been strategically placed in strange crosses and diagonals, as if Bertha had been marking her own territory with a series of keep-out signs, like a boundary wall or a hedgerow around a person's home. Beyond this quintessential marker was an area heavily flanked by red maple trees. In its central core was a neatly swept clearing the size of a small room that was so inconspicuous it was almost invisible. We would play together in this rustic nursery all kinds of games using sticks and stones. One of the games was really weird, but I thoroughly enjoyed it. Bertha would look at a stone. I would guess exactly what it was. I would see a rabbit in my head. Bertha would nod. Yes, it was a rabbit. Next time I would see a fox. She would nod. Yes, it was a fox. I was right about that too. Now I believe this game was a telepathic transfer, where she portrayed or projected a visionary impression on a stone, and I had to perceive it. I'm not sure I'd be good at such a game today, but in those days as a kid, the game flowed seamlessly for me. Another game we played an awful lot was piling sticks over a little stone. The object was to remove the stone under the sticks without moving the sticks above the stone at all. I found it exceedingly difficult to achieve this without unsettling all the overlying sticks, but for Bertha it was so easy. We also played games with garden snails by laying leaves on the ground like a large canvas sheet, where we would place bets on which snail would win the race, after which Bertha usually ate the snails. She would pull out their heads with her tongue and swallow them whole. I would kill myself laughing. "You ate a snail! Yucky, yucky! You ate a snail!" Bertha would sometimes speak audible words to me while she braided my hair, so whatever language she actually spoke, it had a very distinguishable dialect. I never queried what she was saying, but thoroughly enjoyed being in her company, especially when she took me riding on her shoulders, or we went berry picking together, or throwing stones in the lake. Of course, any games that required a measure of artful dexterity, I would lose hopelessly. No prizes for guessing who won those games. My memory of Bertha was of an uncorrupted, generous creature, with a heart of solid gold that was as graceful as she was comical, courageous and strong, with a very nurturing, protective instinct, unlike anything I've ever seen before. I always knew without a shadow of a doubt I was so safe in her charge. It was years later, after my grandmother had sold Whistling Hills Cottage and moved into a nursing home, having become increasingly fragile, that I was to learn more about Bertha. You see, growing up, I had not asked my Grammy any questions about her. I mean, why on earth would I do such a thing, as Bertha was such a natural part of my life growing up, that I never questioned or queried it. Bertha was my grandmother's unpretentious forest friend, who was covered in hair. I thought nothing of it, until I began to learn about the Patterson Gremlin footage. That was when I realised my childhood friend or babysitter had been a Sasquatch, Bigfoot, abominable snowman, or Yeti if you like. It made me feel very special that I had had such intimate contact with such a remarkable creature. But where did she come from? How did my grandmother know her? Why had my grandmother trusted her to take charge over me? I knew the next time I went to visit her at the nursing home, I was going to probe ever deeper in regards to the serious mysteries that surrounded Bertha, who had minded me when I was a little girl all those years ago. Did my grandmother even know Bertha was a Sasquatch? I seriously doubted it. I arrived at the nursing home on a Friday afternoon, more than a little eager to see my grandmother. Most of the nurses knew me so well by now, so they nodded at me cordially with a swift, polite, courteous bob of their heads, as I eagerly sauntered past them. In my hands I was carrying a huge, fragrant bouquet of pink, yellow and purple roses. My grandmother was sitting in an upholstered chair, knitting away speedily at a sweater that she was making for me, when I entered the room unannounced. She looked up at me in surprise, for she hadn't been expecting a visit from me. It was a far cry from Whistling Hills Cottage, a small confined carpeted Spartan space with a single bed, along with a bedside table that boasted an eclectic vintage-looking lamp on its surface. There was a small dresser, a coffee table, a long, thin, rather wobbly wooden closet that looked as if it had seen better days, and was probably as unsteady and unstable on its feet as many of the care home residents were. There was a confined cubicle area that contained a bog-standard white porcelain sink, a loo, a bath, and it was hideously ugly, with wrought iron safety bars attached to them, rubber non-slip mats, obviously for the weak and frail, that would have made your average interior designer want to scream out in horror at the hideous blot on the landscape. But then, as is the case in any care home, practicality overrides beauty at every turn. Even though it was all so desperately basic, exceedingly mundane, tediously beige, at the very least the room opened out onto a small patio that overlooked some pretty green lawns, along with a scattering of mature oak trees, while there was a plethora of bright purple wooden garden benches on display to accommodate the residents along with their guests. I was so struck by how frail and shrunken my grandmother had become, rather like an old shriveled lemon that had lost the cushioning of the pith and become hard. Even though she looked so fragile and gaunt, her pale Arctic blue eyes glittered, twinkled and sparkled with a youthful mischief. I was so glad that despite her physical decline, her mind remained unflinchingly sharp, much like a pencil. "It's so good to see you, dear," she said to me, as she watched me arrange the colourful roses I'd brought for her in a glass vase, placing them on the coffee table. "Oh, there you are. That's so much better. Isn't that pretty?" I said. "Thank you, dear. That's lovely. I do love roses, and those smell absolutely wonderful." "I've got something for you," I said, handing her a tuft of hair in a banker's plastic bag. "That's from Cleopatra's grandchild's mane," I said, referring to one of my grandmother's favourite horses. "I know I couldn't bring her to you, but I thought a tuft of her hair, along with a picture, would do the trick." "Thank you, dear," said my grandmother. "You always were so thoughtful, Flora." She studied the framed photograph I'd presented her, which had been recently taken on the horse farm where I'd grown up as a young girl at Whispering Hills Cottage. I was now stabling a horse of mine on the farm, so I regularly visited the place. My grandmother studied the photograph of the horse, with a bright smile bursting on her face like the sunshine on a cloudy day. A lone nostalgic tear began to trickle down her papery cheek. "No, don't get me started, dear," she said, dabbing away her tears with a tissue. "Looking at the pictures brings back so many glorious memories of my youthful days spent on the farm. I miss them so much, the horses, the fields, the smell of leather and hay. You must grab your youth, dear, very fast. Believe me, it's so fleeting. Grammy, I said, do you remember Bertha? My grandmother's face lit up like a Christmas tree. Bertha! Oh, I remember Bertha. What a beautiful, beautiful soul she was. Do you know she used to look after you for me when you were little? I wonder how she is, whether she's still in life or not. I remember her well, Gram, I said. But where did you meet her? I mean, she wasn't like other people, was she? She was covered with hair for a start, and she was exceedingly big. Do you really want to know how I met Bertha? My grandmother asked me. It's an extraordinary story, it really is. But if I don't tell it to you now, it'll go down to the grave with me, and that would be an awful pity. I nodded. I'd love to know. Please tell me. My grandmother was still for a moment, almost as if in reflective thought. I suppose you have a right to know the truth. Well, Bertha killed your grandfather. That's how I met her, after she kicked him to death with her powerful legs. What? But why? I don't understand. Why would you let Bertha look after me if she killed my own Gramps? Why would you do it? None of it makes any sense at all. I began awkwardly pacing the room, wringing my fists together in agitation. I mean, Bertha, I don't understand. Why would she do such a terrible, terrible thing? The way I remember her, she was such a loving, gentle creature. Why on earth would she kill my Gramps? Bertha, said my Grammy, looking at me with stern blue eyes. I trusted her with my life. It was your grandfather that was the monster, not Bertha. Monster? What do you mean he was a monster? You never made mention of this before. I thought you said he was a nice man. Your grandfather abused me, dear. I grew up in a time when divorce was highly frowned upon. Granted, I could have divorced your grandpa, but I'm ever doubtful I would have walked away from that marriage. He had reduced me to having the self-esteem of a gnat. He did sometimes lock me up in a closet, you know, for hours at a time. What? Are you kidding me? Why would he do that? I don't know, dear. I wish I did. But your Gramps had big issues. I should imagine they caused him a great deal of internal turmoil. I think it all stemmed from growing up in a family where his father abused him. It seemed that the abused eventually became the abuser. It often happens that way, I'm afraid. It's like a perpetual cycle that cannot be broken. What else did he do to you? Did he physically hurt you? Oh, believe me, sweetheart, you don't know what the man did to me, she said, waving a finger. He could lash out at me so violently I'd end up with bruises all over my body. Sometimes he even put his hands around my neck and started squeezing, but he always stopped before it got out of hand. I think he did that to scare the living daylights out of me. Obviously it worked. But he could have killed you. Why didn't you report this to anyone, like the police, for example? Shame, dear. I felt immense shame. I didn't want anyone else to know about my secret life. I was so scared people would find out the truth about your Gramps. He did have a good side to his character, you know. If that weren't the case, I would never have married him. Are you kidding, Grammy? How on earth can you have even considered him remotely good, when he abused you like this? What he did to you was absolutely despicable. They should have locked him up and thrown away the key for good. And to think all this time I thought that my Gramps was a good man. Well, despite everything, dear, even an abuser can have a good heart. There were times your Gramps treated me like a princess. He could be terribly kind, gentle if he wanted to be. But he was a Jekyll and Hyde personality. One minute he was kind, the next minute he was a monster. Don't you see that? But you kept forgiving him. How could you do that? Well, in truth, sweetheart, I'd never have survived the marriage without the horses. I found that going riding whilst managing the affairs of the farm meant that I could pretend that that part of my life didn't actually exist. Of course, when I turned in for the day after a hard day's work on the farm, I would prepare the evening meal. Your pugnacious grandfather would settle down with a couple of beers after dinner, and after a while he became confrontationally antagonistic towards me, for no reason at all. He'd call me all kinds of nasty names. The silliest things would just make him blow up. I mean ridiculous things, and I suppose I became his punching bag. Tell me what happened on the night when Bertha killed him. Well, I'm going to give you a full picture of it, dear, so that you can see it in your mind's eye, as if you were really there. It began as a beautiful day. So magnificent, in fact, that I was enjoying the spectacular scenic vistas of early spring. Flora, I've never even known the service berries to be so beautiful. They were full of glorious white blossoms, along with the dogwoods, while the eastern budwoods luxuriously swathed the trees in bright clusters of delicate pink blossoms, along with the contrasting vibrant red pinks of the crab apples that complemented the viridescent greens of the landscape, making everything look absolutely breathtaking. You see, Flora dear, it had been such a bleak, oppressive, suffocating, sultry and torrid winter, so the first signs of spring was a joyful relief to many, most especially myself. Even the horses weren't immune to the changes in their natural environment. They were drooling happily in the pastures, and believe me, Flora, horses do drool. On this particular day I wanted to enjoy it all, so I went riding on my horse. At the time she was called Sorrento Secret. That was the horse I owned in those days. And lo and behold, I was enjoying myself so much with her. It was euphorically blissful trotting down those horse-riding trails under the vast canopy of a cobalt blue sky, with the sweet fragrant scents of wild flowers wafting in the air, while the soft shafts of sunlight filtered on my shoulders and, of course, across Sorrento Secret's bay back. Oh, I could have stayed out there all day, but my mind was being badgered continuously by the formidable shopping list flashing before me in my mind like a blazing huge white sail on a boat. Your grandfather had given me a tedious, exacting list of things he wanted me to collect in town for him, which included the beef cuts he wanted me to buy for dinner. Your Gramps was particularly partial to a spot of tender, juicy prime rib. Well, when I got into the town, I decided to visit the hair salon, as I realised it had been a while since I'd had my hair done. While I was at the salon, there was a young make-up apprentice there, a delightful young girl called Petunia, who insisted on giving me a free makeover and a manicure. She wanted to collect a profile of before and after photographs for clients wishing to hire her services for upcoming events, like weddings and parties alike. After her attentive pampering, I felt amazingly good, and when I looked at my reflection in the mirror, I barely recognised myself, as instead of seeing a windswept horse rider, I was seeing a very attractive woman staring back at me. The transformation was miraculous. I couldn't believe it was me. So I decided to buy myself a pretty summer dress to complement the entire makeover. I thought even your grandfather would appreciate my new summer look. I was beginning to feel as pretty as a picture, or rather like those flowering dogwoods out there. Everyone in town was complimenting me on my look and saying that I looked absolutely amazing, that I should be on the cover of a magazine. I was about to visit the butcher when whom should I bump into but one of my dearest friends, Nancy Butterfield. We were naturally thrilled to reconnect again after so long. She insisted I joined her for coffee so that we could have a jolly good chinwag and catch up on old news. She invited me back to her house to show me some of her artwork. You see, she was an amateur artist, homing in on her craft, hoping to become an aspiring artist one day, and was already selling some of her work at garden fêtes and fairs. Some of her pictures literally took my breath away, especially a picture of 2 black and bay horses grazing in a field surrounded by bright pink crabapple trees that captivated the very essence of spring. I insisted I had to buy that picture from her. She wrapped it up in some tissue paper for me. It had been such a wonderful spring day, remiserating about everything and nothing. Before I knew it, the day had receded. I knew I'd better get back to the farmhouse to prepare dinner for your Gramps, as if dinner wasn't on the table when he returned back from the stables, he would be as bad-tempered as a grizzly. I always got edgy about getting home, as I knew I had to walk on eggshells with him. It wouldn't take much to set him off in one of his nasty rages. I realised in horror that I'd forgotten to do the shopping. I knew he wouldn't be terribly pleased with me, so the moment I got home, I industriously and energetically bustled around the pantry looking for something to prepare for him. I decided on making some spaghetti carbonara with parmesan and bacon. I knew your Gramps was banking on a steak dinner, but I decided I would tell him that the butcher was out of his favourite cuts that day, that I would pick them up for him in the morning. That way I could possibly suppress his bad temper from flaring up. Besides, he was rather partial to spaghetti carbonara. All of a sudden there was a knock at the cottage door. Who should be standing there in the doorway with my picture, along with a huge beam on his face, but Mr. Butterfield himself. He was a terribly nice man, very easy on the eye, with those quintessential all-American cowboy looks that can make many women go weak at the knees. Of course, I realised that I'd forgotten to take the picture from Mrs. Butterfield that I'd purchased from her only moments before. Little did I realise what a costly mistake that would eventually turn out to be. "Something you forgot," he said to me. "The wife asked me to drop it around to you." He handed me the picture. "How very kind of you. Please do come in," I said. I offered the man a glass of white wine, after which he said, "I must get home. Thanks for the drink." As he was leaving, who should return home from mucking out some of the stables but your Gramps himself. Mr. Butterfield walked past him, giving him a friendly nod, climbing into his truck, driving away. Your Gramps watched Mr. Butterfield leave, in a steeped, stewing silence, as if like a bag of dried prunes he was soaking in what he'd just observed. I noticed his jaw stiffened, his body became rigidly stiff, his back straightened like a pencil. The warning signs that were like red flags to me, for I knew exactly what they meant. A storm was brewing, one I didn't want to get caught up in. Your Gramps turned around to look directly at me. His brown, predatory voucher eyes missed nothing as they hovered over my brand new dress, my fancy hairstyle and my makeup. I can only imagine what was going on in his mind. I watched in horror as his olive-skinned face developed a purple hue. "Who was that?" he asked after Mr. Butterfield had left. His voice began to boom. It sounded like it was bubbling over with anger. "That was Mr. Butterfield, Nancy Butterfield's husband. Remember Nancy, that old friend of mine? We go back a long way." Before I could finish the sentence, my husband grabbed me violently by my arms. "Look at you, woman! You're a floozy! Don't you think I don't know what this is all about? You're having an affair with that man! You bloody bitch! I knew you could never be trusted!" "I'm not having an affair. You misunderstand. I promise you, I'm not having an affair." "Misunderstand? Misunderstand, woman? Look at you, dressed to the nines with a fancy hairstyle. Enough makeup on you to star in Broadway. Goodness gracious, woman, what do you take me for? A complete imbecile? I know what this is all about. The question is, how long has this been going on? How long has this rampant seedy affair of yours been going on?" "I'm not having an affair. You've got this all completely wrong." "What's this?" said my husband, tearing open the frame that covered Mrs. Butterfield's painting that was so elegantly wrapped in pink tissue paper. "Isn't this very cosy? The bloody man brought you a gift. Been giving you a good time, has he? Even I know full well that men don't buy gifts for women just out of the goodness of their hearts. I wasn't born yesterday, nor do I have cauliflower growing between my ears." "Let me explain, Brian. You've got this all terribly wrong. If I was having an affair behind your back, I would hardly rub it in your face, would I? Do you not think I'd be a little bit more discreet about it if I was cheating on you? If you must know, I brought that picture today from Mrs. Butterfield. She's an aspiring artist. It's not a present. It's a purchase." "How convenient for you. You've worked out your clever little excuses masterfully, haven't you? You're quite an actress, aren't you? But you're not fooling me, not for a moment. Save your breath. I can see the empty wine glasses, the large pot of spaghetti on the range. Furthermore, I can see you didn't even do the grocery shopping I asked you to do. Oh no, you had much more entertaining things on your mind, didn't you? Buying me meat was the last thing on your mind, was it not?" "I'm sorry, I didn't get it. I got a bit carried away with the time, I admit, but I'll make amends tomorrow. I'll go shopping in the morning. I'll buy you your favourite cuts of meat, of prime rib at the butcher." Carried away. Carried away. Very good description. I couldn't put it better myself. You got carried away with Mr. Butterfield, you floozy. At that, I suddenly felt my cheek being struck with a violent, icy-cool thrash. It was your grandfather's hand. Then he grabbed me by the shoulders and started to shake me violently. "Stop, Brian! Please, stop! Stop! This is ridiculous! You're barking up the wrong tree! You've misunderstood everything!" The next thing I knew was that Brian's hands were around my neck. As I told you, Gramps had done this mock strangulation exercise on me before, so this wasn't something new. But this time there was something different about him. He was smouldering at the gills, almost as if smoke was coming out of his mouth. His eyes, Flora, I've never seen his eyes like that before. They were like fireballs of indignation. He was absolutely furious. I immediately thrust my legs up into his groin, kicking him very hard. He let out a huge scream, buckling over in pain. I hightailed it out of the front door, making a swift dash towards my truck. But then I realised my keys were in my purse, which was back in the house. It wasn't wise to go back. So I began to run towards the woods. Pretty soon your grandfather was following close behind me, having miraculously recovered from being hit in the groin. I wasn't wearing the most practical shoes. Worse still, I couldn't run in my soft, bare feet. So he was gaining ground on me very fast. We were in the woods by now, and I was breathing rapidly. I held up my hands in a pedestrian stop signal. "Stop, Brian! You must listen to me. I'm not having an affair. I wouldn't cheat on you. I promise I would never do that to you." Before I knew it, Brian had pounced on me. He wouldn't listen to reason, as clearly images of me and Mr. Butterfield frolicking around in a field somewhere, like two passionate lovers, was whirling around in his head, teasing, tormenting and ridiculing him. "Wouldn't you?" he screamed. "Stop lying to me. I know you're having an affair with Mr. Butterfield, woman. I know you're having an affair. How could you do this to me?" By this time he had thrust me back on the ground and was sitting on top of my chest, leaning over me with his strong hands grasped over my neck. I was oscillating my arms and legs frantically, trying desperately to create enough wiggle room to escape. But I was pinned down by Brian's weight, which was crushing my upper torso, squeezing out the oxygen from my lungs. I could see that Brian was incensed with me. There was no coming back from this. It was like everything had transpired against me to make Brian believe I was having an affair. You see that such a blow to his ego was a huge kick in his guts, and as far as he was concerned, I wasn't going to get away with this under any circumstances. It was beyond the point of any rational reasoning. I knew in those moments I was about to die. It was like being in an accident. Everything around you morphs into slow motion. All of a sudden we heard a huge growl, much like a piercing, jagged rumble. For a second Brian looked up through the tree line, his eyes growing anxious. The moonlight was casting its shadows through the trees, so visibility wasn't too bad. He loosened his grip around my neck, while I was struggling to break free. All of a sudden it sounded like a trumpeting male elephant in musk was charging towards us at an alarming speed. And that was when we saw her, a large, furious humanoid, covered in hair, staring at the both of us with eyes so wide, as if reading the situation like a book. It was Bertha. Brian let out a huge, discomposing scream as Bertha lunged willfully towards him, kicking him with one huge blow of her feet, as though she was kicking a soccer ball. She continued to kick him over and over and over again. I could hear him screaming. Then he groaned, and then finally I heard nothing at all. It was silent. I arched over to your Gramps, and as I was leaning over him, I realised he was dead. I can honestly say, Flora, that all I felt was this overwhelming sense of relief. I just knew in that moment that I was free from a man whom had tortured my life for over 10 long years with his relentless verbal and physical abuse. I hate to say this, Flora, I was glad he was dead. I wasn't afraid of Bertha. She rescued me from your Gramps. I knew without her intervention I would be the one lying there dead. She knew your Gramps had tried to kill me. She had come to my rescue. Bertha pointed at my belly. She pressed her head against it as if listening to my womb. It was then I realised that I might be pregnant, for Bertha seemed to have extrasensory abilities, as if she could read intentions and energy. Of course I was to find out I was indeed pregnant with your mother. How Bertha could perceive this little life growing inside of me, I could not fathom, but she clearly did. Of course I called the sheriff. I told him the whole story. Of course, I didn't tell him exactly everything, but I did tell him how Brian had tried to strangle me based on a misunderstanding. He could see the telltale red marks around my neck. I told him I had no idea what had killed your Gramps. I wasn't going to tell him about Bertha, that was for sure. She had saved my life. Why would I get her into trouble on my account? That wasn't going to happen on my watch. I was surprised when the sheriff actually said to me, "I don't feel very sorry for your husband. He tried to kill you. Any man that lays a hand on a woman is not worthy of any respect." I'm not sure what the coroner ruled the manner of death to be, but she perceived that Brian had died from serious internal bleeding due to serious crushing injuries done by something substantially large like an elephant. I wasn't saying anything. I kept my lips firmly shut. I remember at the funeral people were coming up to me, taking me into their arms and saying things like, "You're so much better off without him, dear." I was to find out later that my husband had been having a string of affairs during the course of our early marriage. Everyone in town knew about it except me. I mean, how humiliating is that? But there you go. That's the way the cookie crumbles. No wonder he thought you were cheating, 'cause he was cheating himself. He was seeing the world through his own duplicitous eyes, I said to my grandmother. Well, after your Gramps died, my brother moved on to the farm to help me manage it. I was like a butterfly emerging from a cocoon. I was so incredibly happy. I felt I could live and breathe again. Soon afterwards your mother was born. Bertha would come and look at your mother adoringly. She would hold your mother so gently, rocking her to sleep in her overlong arms. Your mother cried a lot in those days, but the moment she was in Bertha's arms, the screaming stopped. She would start to gurgle and chuckle happily. She was a natural mother, Bertha was. I knew that any baby of mine was safe in her charge. She would play with your mother all the time, watching over her diligently, which was a massive help for me, as I had lots of work to do on the farm. Before long she became an intrinsically important part of our household, and often ate dinner with us. What about her family? Surely she had some. Bertha was on her own. I think her partner had been shot dead by a hunter. That's what she communicated to me. She didn't want another partner after him. She was very loyal. I think both of us, without males in our lives, were treading on common ground, so to speak. But I mean, didn't you think it was strange that she was covered in hair? No, not really. If you have a friend covered in acne, other people might notice their skin condition. But if you live with them all the time, you barely notice it at all. In our minds, Bertha was like that. Yes, she had hair growing all over her body. Yes, she was idiosyncratic and unusual. Yes, she was big. But she was our friend, our special friend. Sadly, it was a mere 2 months after that conversation with my grandmother she died peacefully in her sleep at the nursing home. I'm just forever grateful that I have a greater understanding of the creature that babysat me all those years ago. So there you are. That's my story.
Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners. Please promise me, sweetheart, said my mother, squeezing my hand gently and staring at me pleadingly in her brown eyes. Promise me you'll take care of your father when I'm gone. I just don't want your father to be alone for the rest of his life. Please will you try and find him a kind, loving woman with a good sense of humour, someone who will love him. He didn't sign up for me to be taken away from him so soon. But you're the love of his life, Mother. You know how he feels about you. He could never replace you, never. You can't ask him to do that. You've heard what he said, that there'll never ever be anyone like you again. You know Dad is steadfastly loyal, Mum. Sweetheart, I'm not asking for your father to replace me. I'm asking for you to find him a loving companion, someone who can bring him friendship, laughter, joy in his life. I don't want him to be alone. Don't you understand that? The idea of your father being miserable, sad and lonely, oh, it just breaks my heart. I can't even bear to think of it. I could feel a huge lump developing at the back of my throat. I really didn't want to be having this incommodious, contrived and thorny conversation with my mother of all people. I didn't want to think that the time was running out for her, but I knew it was. She wouldn't be with us for much longer. Her pervasive, aggressive bowel cancer was rampant, like an unchecked bed of weeds, had literally swamped her body with cancer that was beyond saving now. Why do you want me to do this? Because, Stephen, said my mother, clasping my hand in hers tightly. Because you have a sense of your father, like no one else I know. Much more so than your 2 older brothers. You get him. You're intuitive, astute, incredibly perceptive. You would know what he needs in a woman, beyond the superficial scaffolding of just a pretty face. I choked on my words. Was I hearing right? Had my mother lost leave of her senses? Are you kidding, Mum? My shambolic relationships with girls are such a tumultuous mess. I can't make any of them work. Why would I be any good at finding Dad a wife, if my luck is anything to go by? That's why I believe in you, sweetheart. I think you'd be great. I guarantee you'll be able to use those negative experiences with your personal relationships to your advantage, like building blocks of wisdom gained from all your mistakes. You'll be able to pick up any red flags, I'm sure of it. Well, how will I know if you approve of my choice? That is, of course, if I do manage to hypothetically find Dad a wife, and that is a very big if. Well, I tell you what, said my mother, giggling. I'll send you a Bigfoot. It's a marvellous idea.
That will be my clear sign that I approve of the woman you've selected for your father. That given, of course, the angels in heaven are on board with this outrageously good idea of mine. And, of course, if it's permissible and possible on the other side to send you a sign like this, then I almost certainly will. And if it's possible, I'll do what I can to help you in your search for a wife for your father. I might be able to steer you in the right direction. You never know. Are you kidding, Mum? Are those things even real? Bigfoots, I mean. My mother's eyes twinkled. You better believe they are. I saw one on a hike once, watching me through the trees. Oh, she was lovely. She was so curious, with beautiful brown eyes. I remember for a moment our eyes met. Then she just glided away. It was one of the most magical moments of my life. It felt like we made a connection. All right. I can't promise I will succeed in this endeavour, but I will promise you this, that I'll do my level best, but don't hold me to this. Thank you, sweetheart. That's all I could ever ask of you. To tell you the truth, I felt slightly peeved that my mother had thrust such a prodigious responsibility upon my shoulders. I mean, trying to find my father another wife when I was only 22 years old was borderline ridiculous. I wasn't particularly good with finding young women to date myself. I had an atrocious record of relationships that had all frazzled away into nothing after the first month, like an auspicious firework sparkler that at first glance appears propitiously promising as it instantaneously ignites into a glittering, flowering display of hissing flames. But moments later it starts to die, and you're left with a very disenchanting, buckled, smouldering stick. None of my relationships had staying power. I always selected girls that were completely wrong for me, where our personalities would invariably just clash. I didn't think I could do it. Yet I knew my mother was absolutely right. If my father was going to live a full life, he almost certainly needed a companion. My father was the type of man that was so steadfastly loyal, devoted like an old faithful dog, that would lie on its owner's grave until he died himself from a broken heart. I'd heard of dogs like this before, mourning the loss of their owner. My father was the human equivalent. You heard of couples all the time that died within a year of each other, possibly because living without each other simply got too hard. I knew once my mother passed away, my father would invariably shut himself away to live a solitary life like that of a hermit in a cave, disconnected, detached, and disengaged from the rest of the world. I knew he would never even look at another woman, unless I set him up with someone against his wishes, and believe me, that in itself would not be an easy task. My parents' marriage had been electric. The incredible love between the two of them would make most love stories on television seem positively benign and even boring. It was a love story of which fairy tales are made, for their marriage was happily ever after, if ever you saw one. My father loved my mother so much. I could see the helpless hurt and despair he felt as he watched her slowly but surely waste and disintegrate, withering away like a dying rose that becomes increasingly fragile, frayed at the edges, losing its bright flamboyant colours, finally just crumbling into dust, becoming one with the earth. When my mother had died, I couldn't look my father straight in the eyes any more. It grieved me too much to see the raw pain in his eyes. I was still living at home at the time, in the basement flat of our house. I'd intended to move out, but I didn't want to leave now, not with my father in such a fragile state. My two older brothers were married with families of their own, both living in Toronto. Our beautiful family home was situated in Canmore, which is a charming mountain town in Alberta's Rocky Mountains west of Calgary, known for its craggy summits like the Three Sisters. A beguiling, exquisite part of the world with dreamy turquoise lakes, exquisite views that would steal your breath away in a heartbeat. I always counted my blessings as stepping out of my front door every day was like looking at the kind of panoramic, picturesque views that you would find on an illustrious, delectable box of Swiss chocolates, where romantic images of movies like The Sound of Music come flashing into your mind as Maria dances down the mountainous slopes of an alpine meadow, singing "The hills are alive with the sound of music." I assure you, the views of our small town in Canmore conveyed the exact same magic. Once my mother had so tragically died, much as I'd expected, my father, who was not bad looking for a man in his 50s with a thin sweep of grey hair, a square masculine jawline, discerning steely blue eyes, simply shrunk back from the world, wilfully retreating into his shell like a tortoise. I knew his heart was grievously broken. He was struggling to find any meaning or depth to his life. He worked from home at his carpentry business, making kitchen units for one of Canmore's specialty kitchen shops, where kitchen and bedroom furniture was custom-made for exclusive, more affluent, prosperous clients. My demoralised Dolores father clung to the job like a piece of driftwood at sea, as if it was the only thing in the world that was keeping him afloat, for he was drowning in the perilous despair of his grievous loss. Sometimes he seemed almost robotic, as he went through the motions of his daily life like a mechanical computer program. I knew that if things continued in this unfortunate way, I would more than likely lose my father. I was the only one doing the grocery shopping, cooking the meals, encouraging my dad to come out for a walk or go fishing with me. If I hadn't been there for him all the time, I truly believe he would have wasted away like my mother had done, drowned by the tsunami of his own grief. My mother's words rung in my head like a resounding bell. Please find someone for your father. But then who? That was the $101 question, not to put too fine a point on it. At my father's age, available women didn't grow on trees. Invariably, those that were single in his age group were likely to have lots and lots of baggage, such as broken marriages, estranged children, bereavements, and who knows what other kinds of issues. I didn't want that for my dad, as he had enough baggage of his own to contend with already. I also didn't want to look for a woman that was much younger than he was, as too large a generation gap rarely ever works long term. Well, that is what I'd learnt in my strenuous research on relationships, although there are, of course, exceptions to that rule, but I was not eager to engage in exceptions. I doubted any of the women I would find would be anything like my mother. It had been 2 years since my mother's passing. I was now 24 years old, still living at home, but things were not getting any better for my dad. Even my 2 brothers had phoned me up on separate occasions and both said, "Stephen, I hope you're not going to move out of the basement flat any time soon. You know that father needs you. He's relying on you to help him through this difficult time." I mean, talk about piling on the pressure. Worse still, they kept asking what I was going to do about Dad's single status, as if I was an illustrious mobile dating service on wheels that was on the front line of finding Canmore's most eligible 50-year-old single females. "We're relying on you, bro. If you don't mind my saying, you're taking your time. It's been 2 long years since Mum died, and Dad's in a very bad way. Have you seen how much weight he's lost since Mum died?" I wanted to hurl everything, including the kitchen sink, at my obnoxious brother. How could he be so presumptuous? He had the blatant audacity to think finding a good woman was just like taking a casual stroll in the park. If it was so easy to find love, you wouldn't have agencies bursting at the seams with single hopefuls longing to be matched with a suitable mate, or hundreds of dating apps online that still hadn't worked for thousands of people. And why? Because it wasn't easy, that's why. "I'm doing my best, Carl," I snapped, failing to disguise the annoyance I was feeling in my voice. "Well, the way I see it, Stephen, the sooner you find a good woman for Dad, the sooner you can move from the basement flat and start living your own life. It certainly must be hampering your private life, living with Dad." What a cheek! Did he think I was some kind of rabbit where he could dangle a carrot in front of my nose and I'd be tempted to take a bite? I was doing my level best to find my dad a partner. I'd visited dating agencies, gone through hundreds of portfolios of women my father might actually like, but there was something always whispering in my gut that assured me that none of those women were right for him. It was an instinctive knowing that came from I don't know where. He definitely needed someone a little quirky like my mother, but that was not going to be easy to duplicate. I'd been online tirelessly. I'd even humiliated myself standing in for my father during a speed dating session while holding up a photograph of him above my head and pointing directly at his picture, which I know was pretty lame. In truth, I wanted the ground to swallow me whole. My presence at these rendezvous had invited a mixed response from the crowd, with comments like, "Oh, you some kind of a weirdo." "I'm not looking to date my son." Then there were a couple of women who seemed to think I had some kind of bizarre, twisted, secret fetish for mature women and was using my father's face as a screensaver. Of course, when I held up my father's photograph, I was met with a glum response and an audience of disinterested people. "What on earth is wrong with your father? Why isn't he here himself?" How could you even possibly know what kind of a woman he's looking for? It's ridiculous what you're doing." Of course they didn't understand. I mean, how could they? My obstinate father was stubborn as he was pig-headed, like a great big stocky belligerent bull, who didn't know what he actually needed. I also perceived that my father's devoted loyalty to my mother even after her death was certainly a huge stumbling block for him, obstructing the way for him to meet anybody new. He would see that as the ultimate form of betrayal, to hanker after another woman. I knew he needed a wife, but unless I introduced him to the woman that I had selected for him, which in itself was going to be a logistical nightmare, he'd never come to his senses, nor would he see that living on his own in his grief-stricken state was sucking the very life out of his soul. I knew that I was losing my father, for I could see he was slowly but surely becoming a shadow of his former self. Grief had aged my father like the lichen and algae on a tombstone. It had worn away at his identity and life purpose like a powerful waterfall crashing against the rocks with a punneling strength that left everything in its wake beaten to a pulp. My father looked like that, tired, fatigued, wearied, weathered. The creases around his eyes had deepened, his skin had become ashen, his cheeks hollow, his eyes so desperately sad. One night as we were sitting around the dinner table eating some Chinese takeout, I decided to break the uncomfortable silence between us. "Dad," I said, "you're not looking good these days. You don't look well. You look tired, emaciated, very sad." "I'm perfectly fine, son. There's nothing wrong with me." "Dad, I think you need to let Mum go. She's been dead for 2 years. Of course you can grieve, but I think—" "What do you think, son? That I should stop grieving your mother? She's all I can think about day and night. I miss her so much." He said his words almost aching in pain. "Mother wanted you to be happy, Dad. All this despair. It's ridiculous. It's killing you. You need to live again. I think you should start dating." "You think I should start dating?" said my father, his eyes growing indignant. "You think I want to cheapen what I had with your mother by replacing her with someone new? Are you mad? Your mother cannot be replaced like an old oven. Your mother was one of a kind." "I get that, Dad, I really do, but I think you should get yourself a companion. It doesn't have to be the romance of the century, but a solid friendship would be very nice." "If I want a companion, son, I will get one. And in fact, I've been thinking about getting myself an old dog for a while. Maybe you could pick one up for me from the shelter. I would appreciate that very much." Well, that was a start. My father was beginning to show an interest in getting a pet, but I was still convinced he needed a good woman. The following day I went to visit the pound to see if I could find a furry companion for my dad. I stopped dead in my tracks, because standing behind the booth in reception was a woman who caught my attention at once. Now this was the kind of woman I was looking for. She had a quirky manner about her, and even a look that was uncannily like my mother's. Could it be that this woman might just be unmarried? The chances were very remote, but on the plus side I didn't notice a wedding band on her finger, which had to be a good start. I would say she was in her late 40s, early 50s, the perfect age for my father, with shoulder-length, wind-blown, wavy brown hair, kind, bear-like brown eyes that sparkled with humour when she talked. She also waved her arms around enthusiastically like my mother had done, and her joyful personality was definitely infectious. "Oh, I'm so happy," she said, dabbing her wet eyes with a crumpled tissue. "Please forgive me for getting so emotional," she said, blowing her nose into a tissue heart. "I can't help myself. It just brings me so much joy to rehome another one of our animals. I get like this every time." Millie's owner was an elderly lady. Her name was Eleanor Blake. Oh, she was a lovely woman. Tragically, she died last weekend. So for Millie to be going to a forever home is just such a blessing. Now, she's such a beautiful dog, a Schnauzer mix, I believe, with the most docile, easygoing temperament. You're going to love her. She'll be an asset to your family. The woman who was going to adopt little Millie was cradling the dog in her arms, while it was affectionately licking her face. "Oh, I can see that," said the man. "I'm certain she will fit in very nicely with our 2 dogs. We have a red setter and a pug." "Let's get this all settled," said the lady, pulling out the papers for the couple. "You sign over there," she said, pointing to the paper, "and then you'll be able to go home with your forever pet." "Be with you in a moment," she said, glancing at me from the reception desk and giving me a friendly wink. I nodded. "It's fine," I said, raising a reassuring hand. "Take your time." I watched the couple leaving with their newly acquired pet, looking the picture of blissful, contented happiness. "Hello over there," said the woman, approaching me with an eager rambunctiousness that rather reminded me of a friendly retriever. "So sorry to keep you waiting. How can I be of help to you?" I stumbled on my words. I might as well say exactly what I was thinking. I mean, what was the point of beating around the bush anyway? It never got you anywhere. "I notice you don't have a wedding band on your finger," I said. "Does that mean you're not married?" The woman laughed, a bright musical laugh. "You are cheeky," she giggled. "What are you implying?" "No, I'm not married." "Why not? I mean, you're an attractive woman. You should have men beating the door down to date you. Well, men in your age group, of course." "You are very sweet to say that. I'm not married because my husband died 10 years ago during an accident whitewater rafting." "Oh, I'm very sorry. Have you not been interested in dating since his death?" "Is this the Inquisition, son? I hope that it isn't what I think it is. You're not coming on to me, are you? I'm old enough to be your mother." "No, I'm not interested in you like that. But I am interested in you for my father. He needs a wife. You would be absolutely perfect for him. You remind me of my mother. You look exactly like her. I think my father would fall for you hook, line and sinker. You're definitely his type. Quirky, funny, pretty." "I don't know what to say. I'm not married because I never met the right person. But your nonsensical idea of finding a wife for your father, while it's terribly sweet of you, it's a little far-fetched and fanciful, if you don't mind my saying. I mean, finding a wife for your dad is exceedingly different to finding a forever home for a pet, I can assure you of that." "But is it really? I think not. My father is like a lonely old bull mastiff that has no clue what's good for him. He mooches around the place. He's lonely, sad. If he was a dog, any owner would see he needed a companion, even if he can't see it for himself. My dad needs a companion. He needs someone to love him, who can love him back. He needs someone to make memories with." "I'm sure that's true," said the woman kindly, trying her best to be tactful and considerate. "But why me? You don't even know me. How do you know I would be a right fit for your father anyway?" "Because if you must know, over the last year I've gone out on a limb to try and find my father a good woman. It was something my mother begged me to do for him on her deathbed. It was a job I didn't want to do, but I'd promised her. How could I refuse a dying woman? I told her I'd try my level best to find the right person for him. Believe me, it hasn't been easy. I've had people thinking I'm some geeky perv looking for an older woman, as I've hung around in dating lounges like a noxious bad smell, and even speed dating venues on my father's account, looking like a complete wackadoodle weirdo who has a perverse, deviant hankering for mature women. Of course, my father is blindly oblivious to all this, for if he knew what I was doing, he would have a full-blown coronary on the spot. Let's just say he would tell me to mind my own business and stop ferreting around in his life. I've even interviewed women that I thought might be a good match for him, but I just knew in my gut they weren't. When I walked in here today, it gave me the chills, but in a good way, seeing you there talking to those people. You're uncannily like my mother. Your mannerisms, the way you look, the way you speak, your voice. You're hauntingly like her." "I see," said the woman. "I'm not sure what to say to that, or whether that's a good thing or not." "You don't have to say anything, but I want you to meet my father. I mean, even if I'm wrong about this, and there's no spark between the two of you, I mean, what harm could it possibly do? I have a hunch that the two of you will just click." "You seem very sure about this," said the woman, shrugging her shoulders awkwardly. "The whole idea of yours is so bizarre, outlandish even. By the way, my name is Tatiana Webster. It's very good to meet you. I'm Stephen, and likewise," I said, reaching out to shake her hands. As I suspected, much like my mother, her handshake was firm. "Look, before we discuss this any further, why don't you tell me what kind of dog you're looking for? We have so many dogs looking to find a forever home at the shelter, which is why I imagine you came here in the first place, if I'm right." "I have a much better idea than that. How about you come around to our home tonight for dinner to meet my father? Ask him about the kind of dog he's looking for. You could make out it's a policy of yours at the shelter for the benefit of the dog that is being homed, that you match the right dog to the right owner. You've got this all nicely worked out. I'll give you this, you're pretty determined on this quest of yours. For your sake, I do hope it's fruitful. We do actually do home visits for people when we check up on the living environment for a dog. But even so, I'm not sure this is a great idea of yours. I don't even know if I'm interested in dating myself. It's been so long. I'm not sure I'd even fit into somebody else's life, let alone be a wife to them. I'm not being biased, I said. Well, maybe a bit. But my dad's a very good man. An excellent catch. You could do a lot worse. Please. It's early days, but just humour me. At the very least, you'll be able to guide my father into choosing a dog for himself, so it won't be a waste of your time at all. Very well, said Tatiana, scribbling down my address. I'm not really sure why I'm agreeing to do this, but let's just say I'm doing it to honour your late mother. I'll give it a shot. Thank you, I said, giving Tatiana a warm hug. What are you doing? Asked my father, entering the kitchen. You look very industrious. Something smells jolly good in here. What are you cooking? He seemed surprised that I hadn't picked up something in town for our dinner, but was creating a culinary masterpiece all of my own. Your favourite, I grinned. It's chicken stew and dumplings. I followed Mum's special recipe. There's apple pie and cream for afters. It's most unlike you to cook up such a sensational storm like this. To push out the boat. To be so domesticated, said my father, looking slightly perplexed, his beady eyes darting towards the elegantly laid table, which was swathed in a white linen tablecloth, where 3 places had been carefully set, using my mother's finest bone china and silver cutlery. There was also a good quality bottle of Sauvignon Blanc that was standing erect in a bucket of ice. Oh, I invited the lady from the dog shelter to dinner with us. Why would you do that? Said my father, looking befuddled. Weren't you supposed to pick me up a dog? Well, the lady from the shelter, her name is Tatiana. She needs to meet you first to discuss the kind of dog you will be requiring. I've never heard anything so ridiculous, son. Never. I mean, any old mutt will do very nicely for me, as long as he has an agreeable nature. It's hardly rocket science, is it? It's just their new procedure at the shelter, I lied. They like to match the dog with the owner, and the lifestyle, you see. Dear, oh dear, tutted my father. Why does everything have so much red tape attached to it these days? I mean, I just want a dog, for goodness sake. What the heck is so complicated about that? But no, the government authorities like to control our lives at every turn. Insist on all this wretched paperwork just to adopt a dog. Why, son, why did you invite her for dinner, for goodness sake? Isn't that a little familiar for someone we barely know? I'm not in the habit of inviting the postman or the baker for dinner. Isn't this a little bit over the top on your part? Well, she's a very nice lady, I said, not knowing what else to say. My father looked at me suspiciously, as if he sensed I had a rat up my sleeve. Oh, I see, he said, looking at me with a twinkle in his eyes. You're making dinner because you've got a little crush on this Tatiana girl. Is that why you've gone to so much trouble? Now that makes sense. Something like that, I said. Tatiana's account. I couldn't believe it. I'd agreed to actually do this. What on earth was I thinking? I'd allowed a young man to persuade me to come to dinner to meet his widowed father. The whole thing seemed like a preposterously bizarre idea. But something in my gut was telling me to go along with it anyway. I hadn't been in a relationship since my husband had died. I'd reached the conclusion that I was more than happy to live out the rest of my life alone. Granted, there were times I did get awfully lonely, but I was not willing to just settle for anybody. And after dozens of haphazard dates over the last few years, I'd pretty much given up hope in finding love again. It was a minefield out there, and I wanted no part of it. I trembled awkwardly as I parked my truck outside a sizable family craftsman-style home, situated a few blocks away from Canmore's main historic street, that was full of vibrant art galleries, shops and restaurants, set up against the exquisite views of the Rockies. The grandiose house was stylish, but wholesome and practical at the same time. It seemed far too big for someone living on their own, but large homes like this would be very agreeable as a potential home for one of the shelter's homeless dogs. I pressed the wrought iron knocker, banging the bright red front door a couple of times, and was speedily ushered into the kitchen by Stephen, who seemed to be bubbling over with enthusiastic excitement, tickled pink to see me. I felt a flash of pity for the boy. I very much doubted his outrageous plan would actually work. "I'm so glad you came. My father's already in the kitchen. Come this way." Stephen's father was tapping into his cell phone at the kitchen table, which had been laid beautifully. I entered the room feeling ever so slightly self-conscious. What the heck was I doing? I secretly scolded myself. "This is Tatiana from the shelter, Dad. She's here to discuss the dog you will be acquiring shortly with you." Stephen's father glanced up at me. A chill went down my spine. Oh my God, I thought. He was the splitting image of my late husband. How was this even remotely possible? Stephen's father looked up at me in surprise, as if I was the very last person he expected to see standing in his kitchen. His face broke out into a warm, sunny smile. "Hello, Tatiana," he said, reaching to shake my hand warmly. "I'm Christopher." His steely eyes met mine. There was a spark that ignited between us, a passion that was smouldering like an ember in a fiery crate. It happened so fast it was like we were drawn to each other like moths to a light. I'd never experienced such an immediate attraction before, as relationships invariably took time to develop. But in our case, the two of us couldn't take our eyes off each other. None of us even realised that Stephen had surreptitiously left the room to make himself scarce, with a huge grin on his face. I caught him throwing me several thumbs up and a fleeting told-you-so kind of look. Before long, we became so lost in conversation. Christopher and I talked to the early hours of the morning, only eating the now cold food at midnight, but neither of us even realised it was cold. It tasted so very good. "Tatiana, I have to say, I think this is the first time in 2 years I've actually enjoyed my food. The moment you stepped into the kitchen, it was like winter melted and spring was born." Even the topic of the dog shelter had just whizzed away as we became consumed by our interest and intrigue in each other. We even started to dance on the kitchen floor to some music that had magically started playing in the kitchen, which had been sneakily set up by Stephen to create the perfect romantic mood. When it was 2 o'clock in the morning, Christopher begged me not to leave. "If you go, it will break my heart. I've already lost one I loved. I can't lose you as well. I've only just met you, but I feel like I've known you forever." "But I'm not leaving, Christopher. I will be back, I promise." "Marry me," said Christopher, "so that you never have to leave again." I didn't say no when he asked me to marry him, because I knew it felt right, even though this was positively the fastest marriage proposal on record. We'd both been given a second chance at love. I wasn't going to look a gift horse in the mouth, but seize the moment with both my hands, which is what I did, and what we did, if you like. Stephen's father's account. When Tatiana first entered the kitchen, I was stunned. I was expecting to see a young woman Stephen's age. Instead, I was staring at a woman who reminded me so much of my late wife. I never imagined I'd ever meet anyone remotely like her again, but it seems I was wrong. I knew that the old me that had become so lost was resurfacing again like a perennial flower, reappearing after a long, insufferable drought. Tatiana possessed those quirky mannerisms that I'd found so attractive in my late wife. She was bubbly and fun. I loved everything about her. Strangely enough, I reminded her of her first husband, which in itself was rather strange. It seemed that we both connected on every level, as if we'd known each other all our lives. Asking her to marry me was the best decision of my life. It seemed the most natural thing to do, as from the moment I saw her, I knew I couldn't let her slip through my fingers like butter. Our wedding was a very personalised small ceremony, and on the eve of our second anniversary, I decided to take Tatiana camping. I chose the Bow River campground, which is located north of the Trans-Canada Highway of the Three Sisters Overpass, which is a choice spot for fishermen, given the abundance of rainbow trout, brown trout and whitefish on offer. That is, of course, if you do manage to catch any, and that is a big if. We set up a cosy camp on a beautiful clearing overlooking the glittering silver expanse of the Bow River, where the scenic vistas and wondrous views were so delicately reflected on its gleaming surface. On one side of the river was a pretty flowery meadow, And then there were clusters of alpine trees with their long, slender trunks and pine-covered boughs penciling into the cobalt blue sky like tall, willowy skyscrapers. In the furthest distance, rising proud and tall against the sky, were the silhouettes of the mountains that always looked like they'd been generously sprinkled with icing sugar. I decided to make our anniversary special, so I scattered the entire tent with white rose petals, and me and Tatiana spent the day having the most marvellous time fishing and hiking. We cooked the 4 rainbow trout we caught over an open grill, and it was melt-in-the-mouth delicious. We drank champagne and ate homemade pasta with black truffle sauce, followed by thick slices of caramel cheesecake. We then roasted marshmallows over an open fire, enjoying the vast expanse of the ebony sky that glittered with its sparkling clusters of silvery stars, along with a bright luminescent full moon. My wife took out her large silver saxophone from its case and began to play some pretty music for us. It filtered out into the night, the musical notes so pretty against the croaks of the frogs and the chirping of the crickets. "That's so beautiful, Tatiana. That's very beautiful," I sighed happily. "You really are an excellent musician." All of a sudden we could hear a strange movement behind one of the tall alpine trees. "What's that?" asked Tatiana. "Did you see it? Over there?" I glanced towards the tree line that fringed our camping site, my heart almost missing a beat. For under the dappling ethereal light of the moon, I could see the figure of a Bigfoot gliding towards us with movements so graceful he looked like he was floating. I noticed a look of intrigued curiosity on his face as he eyed Tatiana with a look of wondrous awe. "Keep playing," I whispered. "I think it's a Bigfoot. He likes your music." Tatiana continued to play her blissfully exquisite music as 2 Bigfoots stepped out of the dark shadows. They didn't try to hide from us at all, but were completely mesmerized and transfixed by Tatiana's music. It was a female and male Bigfoot. They squatted on their haunches not far away from us, listening and watching Tatiana playing, like 2 enthusiastic, beguiled and enamoured people at an open-air concert. They nodded their pyramid-shaped heads in time to the music, their eyes twinkling gleefully. They kept looking at each other excitedly, as if Tatiana's music was the most wonderful thing that they'd ever heard in their entire lives. The creatures were colossal, well-built, muscular, burly, lofty, majestic, powerful, at about 7 foot tall, 500 pounds, with overlong arms and black shining hair the colour of a raven's feathers, that covered and swathed their entire body, with the exception of their human-like faces and under their hands. Their features were quite obscure at night, but the bright, curious eyes left a lasting impression on me. Never for a moment did we experience any aggression from these creatures, nor did we feel a single ounce of fear. Once Tatiana had finished playing her music, the creatures glided towards us. The female Bigfoot stretched out her hands towards Tatiana. It was clear she wanted to examine the musical instrument up close for herself. Tatiana handed it to her with a big smile on her face. The sax just glittered and sparkled, while the Bigfoot female ran her hands over the lines of the instrument, looking at her partner in awe, as if to say, "Look at this beautiful sparkling thing that plays such magnificently pretty music." The 2 creatures began to talk to each other excitedly, backwards and forwards, backwards and forwards, backwards and forwards, in a strange language. The male Bigfoot then examined the instrument, and then they handed it back to my wife, giving her a grateful nod. The 2 Bigfoot creatures glided away into the forest, swinging their arms backwards and forwards as they moved, making some happy whooping sounds, and then they were gone from our sight. "Did that just happen?" I asked Tatiana, who nodded at me excitedly. "We've just seen 2 Bigfoot," she said. "They loved my music." Imagine my surprise when I recounted my story to Stephen about how we had encountered 2 Bigfoot on our anniversary celebration. I remember he said to me, "My God, she did it." "Who did what?" I asked him. He exclaimed to me that his mother had promised to send him a Bigfoot as a sign that she was happy with the wife he'd chosen for me. What were the chances of that ever happening? The irony of all ironies is that now Stephen himself runs a successful dating agency, so maybe he was meant to be a matchmaker, and a very successful one at that, because Tatiana is the best wife in the world. So there you are. That's my story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, I was about 10 years old at the time, Me and my best friend Nathan Wheeler were throwing old soda cans at the X marking we'd drawn on the sizable girth of a large oak tree in the woodgrove that flanked the houses on the opposite side of the street, which was, I suppose you could say, our quintessential bullseye for our game. It felt good to slam the trunk with a pile of tin cans we'd collected, as hard as we possibly could, with a focus on hitting our target every time. It was a great deal of fun. "Well done, Nathan," I conceded. "You're a much better shot than I am." "Hello there," came a steely male voice. "How you boys doing?" We both turned around to see Dwayne Engelman walking up the embankment towards us with a bright sunny smile on his face. "Lovely day, isn't it?" We nodded. I was exceedingly surprised that Dwayne Engelman was even showing us the time of day. Over the last couple of years he'd usually given us a brief cursory indifferent nod in passing, but never really afforded us a fleeting second glance. Yet it seemed on this morning his attention was almost fixed on us. What did he want, I wondered? Why was he being so unusually friendly? My mother described Dwayne as a good-looking man with a distinctive handlebar moustache. I suppose he did fit the female stereotype of good looks, as he was tall, dark and handsome, but that is in a woman's eyes, not mine. However, if you were a woman who despises ear piercings and sailor ink tattoos, then Dwayne would certainly not be your type. So perhaps it would be better to say he was an acquired taste. I think women might have liked him because he had a bad boy image, was rather rough around the edges. He was a man in his 30s with a full head of dark hair that he wore spunked up in a vertical triangle, rather like a pointed mountain peak. His hair always looked as if it had been deliberately sculptured with a plethora of hair gel. My guess was he must have got through hundreds of bottles of the sticky stuff every single week. He had 2 big ear piercings in his earlobes, the size of miniature coins, 2 studs on his tongue, and 1 circular earring in his nostril. He also had a large tattoo of an eagle on his chest, which he always showed off to maximum effect by wearing his black cotton top wide open so that you couldn't fail to see the fabulous work of art displayed on his tan chest, underneath the heavy gold chain he always wore. As young boys, we thought his illustrious tattoo pretty cool, but we knew our parents would never allow us to get permanently inked ourselves. Dwayne always wore black, a studded black belt, black Levi jeans, and always a black cotton top. I don't recall him wearing anything else but black. I think he liked the dramatic look. "So what are you boys doing?" he asked us awkwardly, his black combat boots kicking up the dirt, while his eyes remained anchored to the ground, as if he found the earthen floor a source of great interest. This was really gross, audacious behaviour, I thought secretly to myself. A 30-year-old man feigning an undisguised interest in hanging around a couple of 10-year-olds that were young enough to be his own kids, like a real social outcast. Had things got so thin, flimsy, fractured for him, I wondered, on the friendship stakes, that he needed to hang around with us? With a father as obnoxious and objectionable as Mr. Engelman, it seemed more than a little likely. It would be a nightmare, I thought to myself, having to play with someone as old as Dwayne Engelman, who was easily in his 30s. "We're just hitting the tree," I exclaimed, trying to conceal my rising level of irritation. Why would the annoying man not just leave us alone? "I can see that," said Wayne, giving us a mock applause with his hands, as if we'd performed some sensational, never-to-be-repeated act. The dude was seriously weird, I thought. We were only hitting tin cans at a tree, for goodness sake. Wayne looked at us directly through his beady brown eyes. "I have a job for you. How would you boys like to earn some really good money?" At this our interest piqued, especially as I was saving up for a mountain bike. My available savings were pitiful. Perhaps Dwayne wasn't so weird after all. He was offering us a legitimate job, and good jobs were in short supply around here. I did manage to get a job at home washing my parents' trucks, cleaning windows for them, but my parents were never lavish with their payouts for these gallant efforts on my part that were deserving of far greater reward, even if I say so myself. I mean, I got my mother's truck literally gleaming, so much so that it sparkled like a glittering diamond. And as for the house windows, there wasn't a smudge in sight. They sparkled, they were so clean, that even the sunlight bounced off the windows in a golden glaze. I had secretly hoped that going out on a limb to do such an exceptional job would in fact earn me a greater wage, but sadly, despite my very best efforts, that was clearly not the case. I told myself after all that exhausting, back-breaking work that caused me to literally bust a gut, that the next time my mother wanted her truck washed, I wouldn't go that extra mile on her account. I'd do a mediocre substandard job for a mediocre pay. After all, fair's fair. You get what you pay for. Isn't that what they always say? What kind of a job? I asked. Doing exactly what you're doing now, throwing things. But this time I don't want you to throw them at a tree. I want you to throw them at my father's house. But why? I asked, looking at Dwayne's solemn, resolute face in bewilderment. Maybe the man was a crackpot after all. No one would willfully choose to throw things at their own house, would they? Why would you want us to throw stuff at your own home? I asked. Because my dad is not a good person. He deserves to be harassed. I want to see that smile of his knocked off his smug, self-satisfied, pompous face. I'm not sure, I said, shrugging my shoulders awkwardly. Can't you ask someone else to do this job? You see, it's a kind of job that could land me in a heap of trouble. My father could ground me for an entire month if he found out about this. My dad can be pretty strict. If he knew I was pelting your house, he would be very upset with me. I'll pay you handsomely. I'll also provide the tin cans, the plastic bottles, eggs, tomatoes, horse, cow manure to throw at his house. We can think of all kinds of lovely things to throw at it. You'll find it a lot more exciting than throwing cans at an old tree. A hell of a lot more exciting. I do feel bad for your father, I said. I know no one likes him, but is it not wrong to just vandalise his property like this? Dwayne looked at us pensively. If I tell you that I think my father was responsible for pushing my mother down the stairs, would that change anything for you? Could I then persuade you to change your minds? But didn't your mum fall down the stairs? I asked. Wasn't her death a tragic accident? Oh, no, I don't think so. Not for a moment. Of course I have no proof in the matter, but I do have my suspicions. That's terrible, I said, wrinkling my brow in horror. If your father pushed your mother down the stairs, that would make him a murderer. My point exactly, said Wayne. Now, do murderers deserve to be walking around town, doing as they please? I ask you that. Me and Nathan shook our heads vigorously. No, he doesn't deserve to be free. He should be locked up. He should be imprisoned for life. My point exactly. If you start throwing things at his house, it'll be a small way of putting him in his place, don't you think? You'll be doing everyone in town a big favour. If the law isn't going to do the job thoroughly, at least you can do something constructive against him. He's right, Emmett, said Nathan. Mr. Engelman isn't a good man. He deserves to be punished. If the law won't do it, we should do it. Good, said Dwayne, looking very pleased. That's settled then. I will let you know when you can pelt his house with the stuff, so that he never catches you in the act. I will know all his chess moves, as I live with him myself. So if he calls the sheriff on you, you'll be long gone. Is that a good deal? We nodded. The idea of throwing turd at a murderer's house didn't sound halfway so bad. After all, he was only getting what he deserved. Better still, we were getting paid for the trouble. Dwayne was basically right. It would be infinitely more exciting than hurling cans at a tree. Besides, that mountain bike was lingering on the horizon. It was literally winking at me. Everyone in our small American town knew what a piece of work Mr. Engelman was, for he walked around the town with a perpetual scowl on his face. If you spoke to him, he rarely ever smiled. Even the way he thundered down the streets in his cowboy boots, swinging his arms viciously in a forward march, with such an aggressive get-out-of-my-way stance, left much to be desired. It was hardly a wonder when his wife was alive. She always walked with her arm nervously clasped in his, looking so downcast, despondent, gloomy. Her brown eyes almost looked frightened, while she'd hurriedly try to keep up with her husband's fast pace, as by contrast to him she was petite, slight, tiny, so her stride was very small. If she was slow, Mr. Engelman's booming voice would snap at his wife. "Goodness sake, Eva! Get a move on! We haven't got all day." My mother said that Mr. Engelman washed away his wife's joy like a powerful laundry detergent on a very hot wash that had left her faded, worn, and simply washed out. My sympathetic mother always extended an invitation for his wife Eva to join her for the book clubs and tea parties. Yet when Eva arrived at these all-woman functions, she would slink away in the shadows, finding an obscure place to hide, and you would barely notice she was there at all. It was like she was a terrified mouse who liked to view the world through the safe confines of her little burrow, as she positively abhorred any kind of social interaction. I suppose it didn't come as much as a surprise that there was no love lost between Mr. Engelman and his son Dwayne, for they were polar opposites in every regard. He wanted Dwayne to become an accountant or a banker, a sensible, reliable job that would earn him great respect in the community. But it would seem his son had become a source of great disappointment to him. At school in his younger days, Dwayne's grades had left much to be desired. But getting an E for math, well, that had always got Mr. Engelman very hot under the collar. It had been an ultimate source of humiliation for him. No one in his genetic bloodline should have got an E for math, not when his father and grandfather before him had been exceptionally good with figures. What on earth was wrong with his son? Wayne was a total embarrassment to him. Everything about his son really annoyed him. One of the things that bothered him the most, that much like his late wife, his son loved to draw. Mr. Engelman saw nothing good about putting pen to paper, unless it was to work out a mathematical equation. As far as he was concerned, drawing for a man made his son a total wuss. Worse still, his boy wanted to run his own tattoo and body-piercing parlour. It didn't get more embarrassing than that for Mr. Engelman. He had high expectations for his son, but then again with a son that got an E for math all the way through high school, it was clear he was hardly going to be running any corporate enterprise any time soon. And as for becoming an aspiring accountant or banker, well, that was never going to happen. But a tattoo parlour? Please, God help him! How could he hold his head up high again with any form of dignity in town, especially with a son who looked like his hair had been struck by lightning, while miniature flying saucers from space had somehow landed in his earlobes, and drawing pins had somehow lodged themselves into his tongue like the staples from a staple gun? Of course he blamed his wife for all of this. She came from a long line of artists with what he would only describe as seriously flawed DNA. He should have checked her family line long before asking her to be his wife. He knew that now. If only he'd married someone a little savvier, shrewd and sharp-witted, who was sagaciously good with numbers, he would have a son that was going places right now, a son that people would look upon with respect and wondrous awe. People in town would say, "There goes Mr. Engelman's son. Do you realise how important he is? I gather he's the top CEO of the Bank of America, or J.P. Morgan Chase." Mr. Engelman's had always loved the idea of basking in his son's success like a crocodile on a sunny rock. But with a son like Dwayne, he'd rather crawl into a burrow like a rabbit and hide. Unfortunately, his son had an excellent portfolio of designs that had enabled him to acquire a job as an apprentice in a tattoo shop, but he was far from happy about Dwayne going down this path. He had expressed his disapproval, made his feelings known by undermining his son all the time with insulting, condescending remarks. Everyone in town had known about how much Mr. Engelman disapproved of his son's choice of career. If that had not been bad enough, his silly wife Eva had encouraged Dwayne all the more. "Oh, Dwayne, you're so talented," she'd say. "You're such an incredible artist." Mr. Engelman physically shuddered at the memory of his effusive wife's rapturous commentary about Dwayne's work. Goodness gracious, woman, he'd thought, stop encouraging the boy. When Dwayne had decided he wanted to run his own tattoo shop, his loopy wife had been on board with the idea. She thought it was absolutely wonderful. "I'm going to give you all the money your grandmother left me in her will, so that you can run your own tattoo shop." Mr. Engelman was absolutely enraged. How could his wife do such a ridiculous thing, throwing good money to source such a preposterous profession that no one in their right mind would take seriously, unless they wanted to procure an insidious acting role on Pirates of the Caribbean? When it came to his wife, Mr. Engelman knew he had her under his thumb. Well, most of the time that was. But when it came to her son Dwayne, it was a whole different ballgame, as that annoying wife of his became as tough as old nails towards him, when it came to defending, protecting, guarding the honour of her beloved son, the quintessential apple of her eye, who could do no wrong in her sight. Now that she was dead, Dwayne would not be getting a single penny of that money for a tattoo parlour, as his wife's money was now nestling very happily in his bank account, thank you very much, and would likely be hatching chickens as the interest increased in the years to come. A real little nest egg for Mr. Engelman. He felt very happy about that. He couldn't help himself from allowing a little smug smile to emanate from the corners of his thin lips, like a victorious victory flag. As for his wife, that silly woman had irritated him all his married life. Frankly, having her out of the way wasn't a bad thing at all, he thought. Dwayne's account. I was so angry with my father. I despised the man, because he was a real bully. The kind of person that wasn't happy if you didn't do things his way, according to his exacting standards. It had been that way all my life. He had that superior attitude, as if he always knew best. He would even interfere with my mother in the kitchen. "You're not supposed to slice the chicken like that." "No, you can't put sugar in that sauce." My father never abused my mother, but he undermined her all the time. He was a perpetual bully, but she would draw the line if my dad said anything about me, as my mother stood up for me like a protective mother hen, guarding her brood. From the day I was born, I had been a perpetual disappointment to my father, especially as he was hoping to gain bragging rights on me. His hopes for my becoming a perfect reflection of himself had sadly gone awry. My mother's death had been devastating for me. She was my greatest cheerleader, encouraging me to pursue and go after my dreams. But now I had to live with my cantankerous, grumpy old dad, without her presence in our home, and that was exceedingly hard. I should have left home a long time ago, but now I was stuck at home for the foreseeable future. I had been saving to buy myself a tattoo parlour. I couldn't waste my valuable earnings on board and lodgings, so I was stuck living with my dad. These days I worked as an apprentice for Joe McCullen, but I was a better artist than he was. He even admitted as much. People visiting the parlour were eager to choose me to do their tattoos, as they knew the quality of my work was absolutely excellent. Was my mother's death an accident? I couldn't be sure. Could my father have pushed her down the stairs? It was a distinct possibility, but not a certainty. But it was awfully convenient that my mother was no longer capable of writing me a cheque. So my dreams to run my own tattoo parlour had been conveniently nipped in the bud. They'd dwindled away. By, of course, my mother's untimely death. Now my father had his sharp, greedy claws on her money. I knew that he was not going to give me a single penny. Of course, I had asked him, but he just barked at me. "Your mother could be a biased fool as far as you're concerned. Granted, if she was here, I admit you would get your pathetic tattoo parlour. But not on my watch. I'm not going to see good money go plunging down the drain-pipe." "But it wasn't your money in the first place," I'd piped. "It was hers. She wanted me to have it." "Well, it's not hers now, is it, son?" "It's mine," said my father, giving me a malicious grin. "You're not getting a single penny of it, son. You think I'm going to lash out perfectly good money for people to become painted with dragons using ink, and to have every single available orifice of theirs pierced? Credit me with a little bit more intelligence, will you, son?" I knew there was no arguing with my father. I could feel the indignant anger rising up in my gut. I knew I wanted revenge. I wanted my father to pay for dishonouring my mother's wishes, and furthermore for taking such pleasure in doing so in the first place. It was when I was walking out of my front door to drive into town that I saw the two kids over the road throwing cans at a tree. And that was when the crazy idea was born. I'd get them to throw stuff at my father's house. As I suspected, it had worked a charm. Several nights during the week my father's house had been assaulted with hundreds of eggs. Then it was cow manure, rotten tomatoes, dreadfully ugly fruit. It had been a nightmare for him to try and wash off the eggshell from his windows that seemed to stick there like superglue. My father was furious, as he was a perfectionist, so having to remove all this gunk from his house was appalling. But the red graffiti paint on his front door that said murderer, that was the final straw for him. I could see the regular assaults on our home had seriously unsettled my father. I was so happy to see the smug, self-satisfied look vanish from his face. I really hoped I was scaring him. I had slashed all 4 tyres on his truck myself. and that had brought me a great deal of satisfaction. Of course, I hadn't been surprised to see the sheriff arriving at our home, having been called over to the house by my frantic father. Like most of the people in town, Sheriff Theodore Quinn did not warm to my father at all. I watched him reluctantly climb out of his police truck and amble slowly over to my father. His normal confident authoritarian stride seemed to convey a subdued, wary reticence. It was clear he was not looking forward to his encounter with my cantankerous, crusty dad. "What is all this about, Mr. Engelman?" asked the sheriff, taking out his pad and pen to scribble down some notes. "Some ghastly kids in town are assaulting my home, Sheriff, with tomatoes, rotten fruits and eggs. And if that isn't bad enough for you, Sheriff, I've had dog turds slip through the mailbox, horse manure walloped against my house, plastering the white paint with filthy smudges that I can't get off, unless I do a repainting job over the whole house. They've even had the blazing audacity to slash my tyres and to write on my door with graffiti paint. What are you going to do about it, Sheriff?" "Who do you think is doing this to you, Mr. Engelman?" asked the sheriff. "Well, someone who's clearly got a grudge against me." The sheriff grimaced. I knew exactly what he was thinking. No one likes you, Mr. Engelman. The whole town has a grudge against you. But he wisely never said a word. "Have you upset anyone recently, Mr. Engelman?" "I'm always upsetting people, Sheriff," snapped my father. "People around here are far too sensitive. They take things very personally." The sheriff raised a quizzical brow. "Well, in the light of what you're telling me, Mr. Engelman, you must have upset someone a lot. Look, we'll patrol your street at night more regularly. Short of that, there's not much we can do until we catch the children ourselves." "I might have known it, Sheriff Quinn. You people are bloody useless, the whole damn lot of you. These kids need to be arrested for vandalizing my home, and you're not doing a damn thing about it. Because, as I was telling you, Mr. Engelman, we don't know who's doing this to you. If we did, we would talk to the kids, find out what's going on, why they've chosen to lash out at your home. But, Sheriff, slashing my tyres is not acceptable, or spraying murderer on my front door in blazing red paint. Now that is just unacceptable." "Oh," said the sheriff, raising a brow. "Now that isn't good." I grinned ecstatically to myself. My dad was getting exactly what he deserved. As far as those two kids were concerned, Emmett and Nathan were doing an outstanding, sterling job in harassing and vandalizing his home. He wouldn't even guess in a million years that his own son was behind these insidious pranks. Emmett's account. The sooner I learnt about the real possibility that Mr. Engelman might have something to do with his wife's murder, the more justified I felt in lashing out at Mr. Engelman by pelting his home. After all, he deserved all the harassment. He wasn't a nice man. Nobody in town liked him. When people heard about Mr. Engelman's house being egged and tomatoed by a bunch of hooligans, I was more than delighted to take credit for our awesome job, although naturally I never said a word. Even my mother had said, "Well, I can't say he doesn't actually deserve it. The man's not a nice character. Who knows if his wife's death was really an accident? That man ruled his household with an iron rod. Poor Eva. My heart goes out to her. Bless her soul. What she must have gone through living under his roof with his hot temper and disagreeable disposition." So it seemed that even the locals in town had their lingering doubts about Mrs. Engelman's death, and whether it had been an accident or not. Still, the coroner had found no reason to suspect the man, so then why should we? In my mind's eye, I was sure he'd pushed his wife over the stairs, and so I felt virtuous, just like Robin Hood, valiantly doing a gallant mission that would bring the miserable man to his knees. It had felt incredibly good being given bountiful cartons of eggs, tomatoes, rotting fruit, horse, dog and cow turd, and all other kinds of unmentionables to throw at Mr. Engelman's house. It was on a Friday night. Duane had given us the all-clear to pelt his father's house again, by giving our in-house phone 3 rings, as in the 1990s we didn't have cell phones. My mother was getting very frustrated that someone was calling us in the middle of the night by ringing the phone 3 times. "It's some kids having a laugh," my father had assured her. It was about 2 o'clock in the morning when me and Nathan surreptitiously crept out of our houses. We lived on a very pretty street lined with oak trees, with wide front yards of viridescent green grass, scatterings of fruit trees, and manicured beds of pretty flowers. All the houses weren't far apart from each other, in what you might have described as ranch-style properties. There was a sprawling wood grove, consisting of maples, oaks, and dogwoods, that fringed the houses on the upper corner of the street. This included the Engelman property, Nathan's house, and of course mine. I'm glad to say that it had never been bulldozed to make way for more houses, but was used by the locals in the area for dog walks. It was a place where Nathan and I would while away the long summer days, playing to our heart's content in the woods. Our parents were blindly oblivious to our nighttime soirees. I was able to climb out of my bedroom window discreetly, when my alarm clock, given to me by Duane, woke me up at the perfect time with a gentle beeping tone that didn't awaken the entire household, which consisted of my 2 older sisters and both my parents, who always remained fast asleep as I wiggled out of the window. I quickly put on my black jeans and matching hoodie, as Duane had insisted that dressing in black and wearing a hoodie would make us a lot less conspicuous and help us to disappear into the background so that we wouldn't be seen by his father. I felt the usual buzz of excitement as I crept out of the house. My heart was beating in my chest with an exuberant expectation, my legs trembling with eagerness. Who would have thought that pummeling someone's house with tomatoes would feel this good? Duane had drawn the line at throwing glass bottles at the house, for fear that someone could potentially get hurt. I realised that doing something high risk where you had the potential of getting caught only added to its appeal. I also felt justified vandalising Mr. Engelman's property. If anything, I was issuing out a punishment that the law had failed to procure on the belligerent, self-righteous man who may well have murdered his own wife. In truth, me and Nathan were heroes of the night, extracting justice where it belonged. The very act of throwing stuff at Mr. Engelman's house was in itself 1,000 times better than throwing tin cans at an old oak tree. Furthermore, what did the oak tree do to deserve to be pummeled like this? But Mr. Engelman deserved every rotten tomato that we threw at his house. A cool breeze was blowing against my face as I met up with Nathan behind the large hedgerow on the edge of Mr. Engelman's property. We were both wearing torches on our heads, although it was indeed a brilliant night, where the moonlit shadows danced from the sky, lighting up the front yards of the homes along our street. "Oh, there you are," whispered Nathan. "You're late. Are you ready?" I nodded. He pointed to the softening tomatoes and pawpaws that were stacked up in huge boxes, giving off a whiffy, fruity smell, along with a couple of garbage bags filled with stinking refuse that had been stealthily hidden behind a large bush. We read the note from Duane. "Please scatter the refuse across the lawn, then throw the fruit at the windows." We eagerly grabbed the garbage bags that were filled with decomposing filthy material and wiggling nasty maggots. We scattered the contents liberally across Mr. Engelman's lawn. I almost gagged, it was so revoltingly disgusting, as the gooey garbage clung to the turf like rampant chewing gum, while the maggots wiggled across the grass. Then we began to launch our attack on Mr. Engelman's home. I felt like a soldier at war, launching an ambush on an enemy camp, doing a mission of the uttermost importance for the good of humanity. All of a sudden we heard an excitable squealing sound. I say excitable because the resonance of the sound reminded me of a giggling, thrilled child, and that was when we saw him. He came bounding out of the dark shadows like an excitable, oversized, rambunctious, soppy puppy dog. We'd not even heard his approach, but this big 4-foot bundle of hair made a nosedive at the fruit. He exuberantly joined us in pelting Mr. Engelman's windows with a fervent enthusiasm. He clearly thought that this was a really exciting game, of which he wanted to play an intrinsic part. Every time a rotten tomato went flying to Mr. Engelman's windows and dribbling down the glass panes, the creature, whatever in God's name it was, let out a thrilled whoop. Whoop! Whoop! As he jumped up and down on his human-like legs. He was so comical, his enthusiasm for throwing the tomatoes infectious. So laughing, we joined in, pondering in our heart what this strange creature could possibly be. It looked so human, but it clearly wasn't. It was covered in hair, was 4 foot tall, with a bullet-shaped head, human face, overlong arms. I could see a silhouette of a figure standing in the tree line watching us. It was enormous, a creature easily doubly the size of the one standing next to us. I knew almost at once it must have been the mother of this strange, incongruous, hairy humanoid that was clearly her little youngling, whom she was allowing to play with us. She hid in the dark shadows, watching her youngling having the time of his life. She didn't seem to mind he was interacting with a couple of human kids. He eyed us through his sparkling brown eyes, as if to say, "Go on, aren't you going to keep throwing tomatoes? Why have you stopped?" We'd only stopped our throwing because a strange human-looking creature covered in hair had grabbed our attention. We were studying him curiously, with a wondrous awe and intrigue. The creature made our tomato throwing look absolutely pathetic. When he launched his red missiles, they crushed against the glass so violently hard that the panes on Mr. Engelman's windows began to break all over the place. Crack! 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 The next thing we knew is that Mr. Engelman's bedroom light came on, then the lights of his front porch. Finally, the front door swung open. I could see the pugnacious, bellicose man bolting out of the house, carrying a baseball bat in his hand that he was holding up in a striking position, as if waiting to beat the living hell out of the perpetrators. "Who's out here?" he screamed. "I've had enough of you bloody kids pounding the windows, breaking them. You've gone too far now." I could see the large creature disappearing into the woods, responding to the sounds of his mother's earnest whistle, who, on seeing Mr. Engelman storming around the yard, had obviously decided to call back her youngling. He looked so desperately disappointed as he left, but glided away, grabbing a couple of pawpaws as he went. I don't know why, but the comical creature breaking all the windows had been so desperately funny to watch, that despite the booming voice of the angry Mr. Engelman, me and Nathan were doubled over in laughter, and almost wetting ourselves in the process. We tried to run away, but our giggles seriously impeded and hampered our progress. Our legs did not gain much momentum. You could say we were inebriated by the humour of what had just transpired, for the powerful creature, oblivious of his own strength, had not only successfully succeeded in pulverising the fruit into a messy sludge, but broken all Mr. Engelman's windows, and broken glass was scattered absolutely everywhere. The next thing I knew was that Mr. Engelman grabbed me. As I was running away, he pulled off the hoodie from my head, while Nathan managed to successfully escape. He looked confounded when he saw my guilt-ridden crimson face. "Emmett Jensen! I can't believe it's you! Of all the potential young hooligans in our neighbourhood, you were the last person I ever imagined would do this to me. Wait until your parents hear about your atrocious behaviour." He dragged me by the scruff of my neck, marching me towards my parents' house to face the ultimate humiliation at about 3 o'clock in the morning. As you can imagine, I was in a whole heap of trouble. My father came down on me like a bulldozer, grounding me for well over a month. I'd never seen my parents so angry before. My father was practically breathing fire. He said he'd never felt so ashamed and disappointed in his entire life. "I didn't raise you, Nathan, to become a vandal. What the hell do you think you were doing, throwing stuff at Mr. Engelman's windows like that?" "I'm sorry, but he deserved it. Everyone knows he murdered his wife." "That's not true," my father said. "His wife fell down the stairs. It was an awful accident." "He needs to be punished," I said. "Son, you're not judge, jury, and executioner," said my father. "You have no right to behave like this. I am very, very ashamed of you. Who put you up to this?" "No one," I lied. I had no intention of snitching on my best friend, nor the hairy humanoid in the woods, or even on Dwayne Engelman himself. "Where did you get all these rotten tomatoes and pawpaws from?" "I found them." "Who was helping you? Was it Nathan?" "Of course not. I did this all on my own," I lied. Suffice to say, even the sheriff had some stern words for me, assuring me that regardless of the way I felt about Mr. Engelman, I had no right to vandalise his property. "But he murdered his wife. Someone had to do something." "The case is closed, son," said the sheriff. "It was an accident." But he said this with hesitancy in his voice, as if he secretly wondered whether I might just be right. Needless to say, I was expected to pay for all the damages done to Mr. Engelman's windows caused by the hairy creature. I was also expected to help him with yard work around his home to make up for what I'd done, and to cover the costs of the slashed tyres, along with the paint for his front door and the broken windows. So it was a long while before I got that mountain bike that had been winking at me in my dreams. All these years later, I realised the comical creature I encountered that night was a Bigfoot. Dwayne was exceedingly grateful that I never snitched on him to his father. When I turned 15, he opened his own tattoo parlour in town. I gather with the help of a lawyer, he managed to get the funds from his father to buy his own parlour. Everyone could see that Mr. Engelman was not happy that his son had become a tattoo artist, but in the end, he had to grit his teeth and bear it. Dwayne invited me and Nathan to be the first to have a free tattoo. We had to hide the evidence from both our parents, so we both had a dragonfly done on our lower hips. Whenever I look at it, I think of that playful Bigfoot that wanted to join us in our game, because obviously now I know it was a Bigfoot that we encountered. I only wish we could have seen him again. He was such a cheerful, congenial creature. So there you are. That's my story.
Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, becoming wealthy wasn't all it was cracked up to be. The only way I can describe it to you based on my own personal experiences is it's rather like climbing a perilously steep mountain. You're told when you get to the very top, all your troubles will abandon you, like the rain clouds holding back their threatening showers on a sunny day. But the funny thing is that despite your very best efforts, the clouds will finally relinquish their heavy load, so the rain still comes thundering down, even if it does so in a different way. Once you've reached the summit, you'll be able to stare out over the most exquisite views that will quite literally take your breath away. You'll know that the tortuous, gruelling, insufferable climb to the top that left you heaving, groaning, sweating like a pig was worth it in the end. If only it was that plain sailing. I regret to say that it's not. You may have unburdened yourself with a monstrously heavy backpack of financial struggle, only to find yourself being lumbered with a backpack that may be more glittering and upscale on the surface, certainly more appealing. But what they don't tell you about that backpack, the one of the wealthy and elite, is that it can sometimes truly stink. In my case, the journey to the top of the mountain was a huge struggle, especially since I came from an impoverished background, which meant the odds of making it big someday were seriously stacked against me. I had been raised by a devoted, steadfastly loyal, self-sacrificing single mother, who barely had a brass farthing to rub together. I had grown up in a rented apartment along the Wilmate River, close to the steel bridge in Portland, where we had an obnoxious landlord who insisted my mother sleep with him if she couldn't pay her rent in time. I would remember hearing her sobbing in her pillow at night, saturating the cotton covers with her tears. I knew she was hurting. She was a proud woman, so demeaning herself like this was certainly breaking her heart. But she had little choice in the matter, certainly if she wanted to keep a roof over our heads, that is. Even at such a young, tender age, I felt completely enraged about what was happening. Just because we were poor didn't mean we had to be treated as if we were just pieces of trash, but that was how we were made to feel. The looming, gruesome monster that hung over our lives like a disgusting, vile infestation of roaches was no other than Mr. Lawrence Deville. He was an unsavoury gutter rat if ever I saw one. He owned several apartment blocks where he exploited his tenants who had fallen on hard times to his own ends by charging much more than the acceptable going rates for rent, especially for such run-down, dilapidated and gloomy apartments that were as starkly oppressive as they were unsatisfactory. This obnoxious, unpalatable dude was so ruthless that if you were a single day late with paying your rent, he was known to throw out your worldly possessions in the front yard to humiliate you, demanding you to leave his premises forthwith. "Get out!" Mr. Deville would scream again. Forget about rental deposits and stuff like that. This loathsome, contemptible and lawless character got away with absolutely everything outside the law. You would never even contemplate putting up a fight with this reprehensible character, for he had muscles on him that suggested he might have been indulging in steroids along with some strenuous gym workouts. You knew that based on his Goliath size, you would do well to avoid being on the receiving end of his weighty fists. He had been responsible for beating many of what he considered to be ungrateful tenants to a pulp. I'd seen it with my own eyes when a courageous tenant had stood his ground, demanding his rights against this obnoxious, atrocious man, which would invariably end up costing him several broken teeth, a black eye, and, of course, a dislocated jaw. I had learnt about a dead body of one of the tenants in our block, found near the steel bridge, with a single gunshot in the head, that was rumoured to be Deville's pestiferous work. The death had masterfully looked like a suicide,
But I believe that was all staged to look exactly like that. I'm certain that the malignant Mr. Deville had fired the lethal shot himself, but masterfully deceived the coroner with his guileful cunning. Men like him knew how to manipulate the law to their own ends. It would seem if you were female and moderately attractive, he would negotiate other more sordid means of meeting your monthly rental payments, for this man cared not for anyone else but himself. I remember I would sometimes sit on the long metal staircase reading a book that I had taken out from the local library, as reading books was my escapism from our cruel hard life. Mr. Deville would literally kick me out of the way with one of his leather boots, as he trudged past me, giving me a huge scowl. He didn't ask to be excused, but chose to kick me like a dog. "Get out of the way, boy," he would snigger. I knew if I was bigger and older, I'd give him a kick in the nuts that he'd never ever forget. From thence on, motivated by my extreme anger, I had decided that when I got older, I would make it big, as I'd seen the unfortunate disadvantages of what poverty could bring. I refused to allow my impecunious, pauperized background to cripple my success. It just meant I had to work 1,000 times harder than most to climb the ladder. But climb the ladder I would, and I did. I was to learn if you want something bad enough in life, and you believe in it, whatever it is, you will get it, but there is a catch. You have to 100% believe in yourself. Even a smidgen of doubt can hamper your progress along the way. It would be like adding oil to the steps of a ladder, making your climb significantly more precarious. By my early 30s, I'd made a substantial financial fortune from real estate, selling million-dollar properties to Oregon's opulent fat cats. Before long, I was mixing in the circles of the rich, affluent, deep-pocketed and well-heeled members of our society. As I was saying, getting to the top of the mountain, after the onerous struggle to get there, was more than a little revelatory. When you reach the summit, you realize that the views weren't that great after all. And although wealth is empowering and exceedingly liberating, let's not kid, it gives you freedom. But on the other end of the scale, you find yourself caught up in a world of the entitled, and some of the attitudes of the exceedingly wealthy are just too horrifying to articulate. Of course, not all wealthy people have this haughty, patronizing and pompous mindset, but regretfully many do. It seemed I'd swapped one set of struggles to embrace another. Of course, there were great advantages to having lots of money, and I won't deny that for a second. I bought myself a very attractive showstopper lakefront craftsman-style home on the north shore of Lake Oswego that boasted a stunning boathouse. Lake Oswego is better known as Low, which is a Portland suburb centred on a lake with a very cute downtown of boutique shops, restaurants and charming little cafes. My mother moved into a cottage on the property, as I was desirous to give her a lifestyle she deserved, to compensate for the times when she had sacrificed so much on my account, doing God knows what for us to survive. Ostensibly, as I got caught up in this plutocratic world of the very rich, I beheld an ugliness in the pretentious, toffee-nosed attitudes of many that would make me recoil in disgust. I'd see pretty women throwing themselves shamelessly at rich men, in the hope of acquiring a luxurious lifestyle for themselves, where they wouldn't have to want for a single thing. They would flatter their long fake eyelashes provocatively, while wealthy, seemingly intelligent men, clearly flattered by their flirtatious advances, would come running like lambs to the slaughter into feminine arms that cared not about them, but only about their flourishing, plenitudinous bank accounts. Many of the wealthy men didn't care about this insane exploitation, as long as they had a pretty model on their arm to pump up their self-esteem like a flagging balloon at the fair. It was ridiculous, if not absolutely pathetic, so much so that I almost felt sorry for them. I was eyewitness to the disastrous consequences of self-indulgent relationships that were seeded from a voracious, gluttonous greed that ultimately, like a tumbling wall built on a shoddy foundation, would come crashing down like a game of cards. For none of those intemperate relationships ever lasted. But then I ask you, how can a union built on the fragility of a flimsy, thin piece of paper have any staying power whatsoever? It's going to be blown away by the wind at the first sign of trouble, as pretty soon the fake smile of glistening white teeth will wane and dissipate like a wispy trail of smoke, while the long fake eyelashes will be fluttering for another man, and not you. I'm sorry to sound so cynical, but this is exactly what I've perceived over the years. I was at a time of my life that I wanted to settle down and raise a family of my own, but finding the right woman for me would be a challenge, as I wasn't short of attractive women throwing themselves at me based on my net worth. They weren't adverse to laying on their audacious, flirtatious charm as thickly as butter on bread, and being extravagantly generous with their flattery, telling me what I wanted to hear. Perhaps it was the fact that I had been raised from such an impoverished background that had made me so savvy and worldly wise, cautiously cynical and suspicious. I could see through it all, the insidious duplicity, like I had done with Mr. Lawrence Deville all those years prior. I wanted a real, wholesome relationship, built on a foundation of love, one that would stand the test of time. So far, even against my own better judgment, I was to discover that most of the women I dated were quick to drop me like a hat when I pretended that my large lakefront house wasn't mine after all. It was so easy to be seduced by the superficial veneer of a pretty face. My mother could see through those girls better than me. "She wants you for your money, son," she'd tell me. "You mark my word, she's like a magpie, wanting to align her nest with gold nuggets all from you." That wasn't what I wanted to hear, but in my gut I knew my mother was absolutely right. Denial would be easy, but sooner or later it comes back to haunt you like a leak in the ceiling, finally becoming so saturated by water that it falls to the ground, folds in on itself, refusing to be ignored and needing to be fixed. And so it was I masterfully tricked the woman I dated with a fox-like cunning to test the water of their intentions. Were they interested in me, or was it all about my money? "I wanted to impress you," I would lie to them. "I'm afraid I'm not really that well off. The house belongs to a wealthy uncle of mine. I'm just house-sitting here for a while to look after the 2 black Labradors while he's away. I have a tiny apartment of my own in Portland, and of course a very middle-class salary." "But I don't understand. I thought you owned this all," they would say, their fixed smiles collapsing, their eyes growing downcast, their proud, flirtatious body language deflating like a punctured beach ball. "I'm afraid not. Does it even matter?" "Of course not," they would say, trying to replace the fake smile on their faces, but failing miserably in this endeavour, as a frown was more forthcoming now, and it ruined their attractive look, like a blob of black ink on a perfect painting. As I had anticipated when I invited them out for a date again, they invariably turned me down with a whole host of excuses like, "I don't think it's going to work out between us. We haven't got much in common." So when I came clean and admitted that the lake house was actually mine, their brazen, unabashed interest in me would ignite again, like those relighting birthday candles on a birthday cake. It would make me sick to my stomach, as I knew in my heart what they wanted. In my opinion, they were like profligating carpet moths, incorrigibly burrowing in my life with an insatiable appetite, only interested in what they could get out of me. It boggled my mind that other rich men didn't care about this, for I assure you many didn't. Could they not see the serious ramifications of a superficial relationship? It was hardly a wonder that many of the marriages of the wealthy were littered with the carcasses of former relationships that had ended up on a scrap heap, like the waste at a landfill site. So meaningless, so pointless, so pathetic, it's almost sad. One night I was awoken to the telephone ringing. It was in 1985, so in those days we didn't have the luxury of cell phones. I woke up with a start, my heart pounding in my chest, as a quick glance at the clock on the bedside table had made me brazenly aware that it was 3 o'clock in the morning. It was early, far too early to be calling, unless it meant something terrible had happened. My mind oscillated like the tentacles of a frantic octopus at the end of a fisherman's spear, as I imagined all kinds of horrifying scenarios. Had something absolutely terrible happened to my grandmother, I wondered? I quickly grabbed the telephone, my hands trembling, my body stiffening, as I placed the receiver to my ears. "Hello? Ashton Older speaking." I could hear a woman screaming down the phone at me, although her scream sounded more like a wail. "You made me pregnant! You made me pregnant! Look what you've done! You've gone and made me pregnant! How could you do this to me? You've made me pregnant!" I knew the poor woman had phoned the wrong number by accident. My heart naturally went out to her. I didn't know who on earth she was, but I knew by the sound of her dismayed voice that she certainly was in a dreadful state. Sorry, ma'am. You've got the wrong number. Take a deep, deep breath. Nothing is as bad as it seems. Take it from me. Being pregnant is not the worst thing that could happen to you." She was about to slam down the phone on me when I said, "Stop, ma'am. Don't slam the phone down. Tell me what happened. I'm sure you could do with a listening ear right now. I'm a very good listener. Maybe I can help." "So this isn't 334, 333? "No, it's not." "I'm really sorry to have troubled you. I better go." "It's no trouble at all. Listen, I meant what I said. I'm a good listener. Who made you pregnant?" "My boss at work," cried the woman, who seemed relieved to unload her troubles onto my listening ear. "I only got the job because I agreed to sleep with him. I know it's silly. I'm a receptionist. The salary's so good. I'd never get a job paying so well with anybody else. I wish I could leave, but I'm stuck between a rock and a hard place. You see, I'm raising my late sister's 4-year-old daughter. I want to give her a good life." Her horrifying revelations brought a lump to my throat, along with the tormenting memories of Lawrence DeVille's repugnant exploitation of my mother that came crashing into my mind like the waves of a thunderous ocean. "I know all about that kind of bribery, ma'am. When I was growing up, my mother, well, we had a landlord, Lawrence DeVille his name was, a real gutter rat that expected special favours from her. Otherwise he threatened to throw us out of our apartment." There was a long silence at the other end of the line. "Lawrence DeVille? I don't believe it. You know Lawrence DeVille?" "What don't you believe?" "Well, Lawrence DeVille is the father of my boss. I've met him before, and you're right. He's a gutter rat. He lets out apartments near the steel bridge, exploits all his tenants. He's got filthy rich out of the suffering of others by inflating his rental charges." "That's right. That's where I grew up as a boy. Well, one of his apartments, shall we say. The place was hideously dilapidated, infested with vermin and roaches, but he did nothing about fixing the place up. He was only interested in one thing, money." "Well, it's his son Luca DeVille. That's the one who's made me pregnant. If you think that Lawrence DeVille was nasty, Luca's 1,000 times worse. The only women that get promotions at work are the ones that have graced the linen sheets of his fancy hotel bed. I can't believe the naivety of his wife. She doesn't even suspect a single thing." It took me a while to adjust to what the woman was telling me. It was like a knife had severed itself into my guts. I could see that the fists I was making with my own hands were growing white. Now this felt personal, very personal. Granted, I didn't know this woman on the other end of the line from Adam. But now that a son of Lawrence DeVille had so vindictively exploited her, as irrational and incomprehensible as this may sound, I felt involved. "Where are you?" I asked. "Can I come and see you? I'd really like to help. You see, Lawrence DeVille was the bane of my childhood. I'd like to get even with him. He hurt my mother. Like father, like son, it would seem." "Well, there isn't much you can do. I'm pregnant. If you beat Mr. DeVille up on my account, bang goes my job. I can't afford to let that happen to me. I really need this job, in my current state, now more than ever." The young woman at the end of the phone, who told me her name was Beryl, gave me her address. Before long I found myself embroiled in her life. But this was through my own choice. I would regularly visit her apartment, but never ever did I let on that I was a man of means. Beryl was in her early 30s with sleek brown hair, brown eyes and a fair skin. On first impression she reminded me of a doe, a frightened deer with very watchful, troubled brown eyes that were very slow to trusting. I felt drawn to protect her, along with her cute little 4-year-old niece, Valentina. In a trice I found myself falling for the delightful duo. But I knew that Beryl didn't need a relationship, she needed a friend, and that is what I would be for her. We would spend happy summer evenings together in her apartment, eating pizza, watching television, playing Scrabble, and always talking. A month into her pregnancy, Beryl informed her unsuspecting boss that she was pregnant with his child. As she had anticipated, revealing her secret had been counterproductive. "Get rid of the baby," he demanded. "I want nothing to do with it." "That's fine," Beryl had told him. "You don't have to have anything to do with it, but I'm still keeping him or her." Luca's face grew purple with rage. His jaw stiffened, his eyes tightened into tiny slits. "Think very hard about what you're saying, Beryl. I'd hate you to regret your decision. It could be a very costly one." Beryl's account. I was not the only female employee in the company that he had taken advantage of, nor would I be the last. Luca had the heart of a crocodile, the compassion of a black mamba snake, and it wasn't surprising that he was in short supply of any friends. When I'd informed him that I was pregnant with his baby, it had gone down like a lead balloon, but I hadn't expected anything less. "Well, I hope you're going to get rid of it." "Of course not," I said. "I don't believe in that sort of thing. A fetus can feel pain. I could never harm the baby growing inside me." "What poppycock? Fetuses don't feel any pain." "I've seen documentaries about it," I said, my eyes brimming over with tears. "I'll pay you good money for you to get rid of the baby." "I'm sorry," I said stiffly. "I'm not getting rid of it. You don't have to have anything to do with it, Luca. I won't tell anyone it's yours, but please don't fire me. I need this job." "Get out of my sight," he had growled, leering at me through his belligerent eyes. Shortly after this event, I was almost certain that after work hours I was being stalked and followed. It always seemed to be the same unscrupulous-looking man slipping into the shadows that seemed to be behind me. When I was buying coffee at the coffee shop, I could see him there, always watching me from every corner. I'd spotted him at the grocery shop, and then when I picked up my 4-year-old niece from day nursery. I'm certain he wanted me to see him. I'd also seen him in a parked truck, pretending to bury his head in a newspaper. Was this Luca's way of intimidating me in order to make me get an abortion by having me followed, I wondered. Well, it wasn't going to work, I thought angrily to myself. 2 months had gone by. Ashton Alder had seamlessly become a huge part of my life. He would visit me regularly. I was very happy for his company. I imagined that growing up in an apartment close to the steel bridge, that he possibly had a rather mediocre job, made a basic salary for a living, and thought better to ask him too many questions about his life, as it was certainly clear his childhood had been a source of great pain for him. He had never invited me around to his apartment, which I expected was probably a rough-and-tumble bachelor pad on the rough end of town. I was glad to have met him. He was becoming a great friend to me. Furthermore, I really loved the way he interacted with Valentina. It was clear that my adopted daughter adored him. As the moment he came to the front door, she was throwing herself into his arms and saying, "Mummy, Mummy, Uncle Ashton is here! Uncle Ashton is here!" I was falling for him, but I sensed he didn't feel the same way about me. It seemed he had a bee in his bonnet about Lawrence Deville, and knowing that I'd been taken advantage of by his son had made him exceedingly protective towards me. I think he saw me more as a friend than a romantic partner, but this was a friendship I rarely appreciated and needed, at such a fragile point in my life. It was great that Ashton had our backs. One day Ashton persuaded me and Valentina to go camping with him. "Go on. Let's do it. It'll be great fun. I know an area of national forest overlooking a sparkling silvery lake where we could all go camping together." I was delighted with the idea. I hadn't been camping in years. It would be great fun. No one was more appreciative about this idea than Valentina, who seemed to be jumping up and down with glee like an excitable puppy dog. "We're going camping! We're going camping! My dollies are going to have a holiday and lots of tea parties by the lake." I watched Ashton picking Valentina into his arms, rocking her gently on his knees, kissing her affectionately on her buoyant brown curls. "That's right. Your dollies are going to have a very lovely holiday." "Yay! Yay!" cried Valentina. "Did you hear that?" she said to her doll. "We're going camping! We're going camping!" I was amazed that Ashton had found the most perfect spot for us to camp. He had gone to town without sparing any expense. He told me he'd hired all the camping gear and even the truck, but it was the finest quality, must have cost him a pretty penny, which I rarely appreciated because I didn't expect that he was very flush. Our camp was set up on a sizable sandy beach, overlooking the large, pristine lake, that was heavily fringed by towering, vibrant, viridescent greens of Douglas firs and western hemlocks, overlooking the most spectacular scenic views over Mount Hood, where prominent white mountain peaks soared up into the cobalt blue sky like a giant vertical snow-covered cake. The day had been so wonderful. We'd spent our time fishing while little Valentina was bustling around on the beach, playing with her 3 favourite dolls and her plastic tea set. Despite the intriguing panoramic beauty that surrounded us, I got this overwhelming, uneasy, very queasy impression that we were being watched. And with no campers in close proximity to us, I put it down to my overactive imagination playing tricks on me. During the week I was still being stalked by that obscure, sultry stranger. On one occasion I'd literally turned around to see him sitting there in his truck, watching me collecting Valentina from her daycare. I had glared at him defiantly, feeling the heated indignation rising up in my face. I had run up spontaneously to his truck. "Excuse me, sir. Are you following me by any chance? What do you want?" The stranger in the truck had wilfully ignored me. He simply turned on his engine, accelerated away. I knew he wouldn't have reacted like that if he had nothing to hide. I surmised that Mr. DeVille Jr., or Luca if you like, was hell-bent on my getting an abortion, was hoping that by escalating my level of fear, he would get me to crumble under the pressure. Every day on my landing, I would find hundreds of brochures about good abortion clinics, along with little warning notes written in a child's red crayon saying, "Get rid of it, or you'll be sorry." After a lovely, bright, sunny day, with not much success on the fishing front, me and Ashton turned in for the night. Ashton pulled out some prime cuts of meat from the cooler. Before long, the smoky, rich, languid, sweet smell of barbecue wafted over the sandy beach, infusing the air with an aromatic, comforting, smoky haze of deliciousness that left me drooling. The delectable melt-in-the-mouth barbecue meat, washed down with Mr. Peppers, served with crisp, vibrant salads and soft, crusty French bread, did not disappoint. We ate tender pieces of marinated, juicy chicken and steak with our fingers, licking off the fragrant juices with our tongues. This was al fresco eating at its finest. Ashton opened up a wonderful bottle of white wine. We sat back to enjoy the sun setting over the valley, dappling the sky in long streams of gold, tangerine, yellow and pink. It then folded away swiftly as the sky retired from a hard day's work. The evening was invited in to bask the sky in a rich velvet blackness, ostentatiously highlighted by the sparkling diamond-like jewels of the silvery stars. We both pointed to the constellations, while we watched the crackling, spitting flames of the fire pit, not really finding much need to talk about anything, as we were equally enjoying just soaking in the wonders of the natural world, like 2 hungry sponges. "I'm going to get some sleep," I said, standing up to stretch as I began to yawn. "I think that's a good idea. I think I'll join you." I must have crashed the moment my head hit the pillow, but I was woken in the middle of the night to the urgent need to answer a call of nature. I found a torch, retreating out of my tent, as a cool breeze blowing against my face and the aromatic smells of the barbecue still hung in the air. I was grateful that the luminescent light of the moon offered a certain amount of reassuring light. As I moved through the dark shadows, I noticed everything seemed airily quiet, unnaturally still. It was as if the croaking frogs, along with the chirping crickets, had become subdued. That was when I saw him. I recognized him immediately, the man who'd been trailing me for weeks. He was dressed in black. I didn't say a word, as the bright beams of my torch hovered over his grim face. The murderous look he gave me sent chills down my spine, and a nauseous feeling descending in my gut. "Beryl," said the man, pulling out a revolver from his holty, "don't take this personally, but your boss wants you dead. You refuse to have an abortion. You refuse to listen to his messages. So I'm afraid it has to end like this." He was about to press the trigger of his revolver backwards and wantonly unload it into my guts, when suddenly, bouncing through the forest at one hell of a speed, was something that sounded monstrously huge, like a rhino in full charge, thundering towards us. The earthen floor of this wooded sanctuary boomed and rumbled as it made its approach. I was too frozen by shock to even react. Like a wax statue at Madame Tussauds, I just didn't move. "What in God's name is that?" said the man, turning his revolver towards the thing that was tearing towards us. The creature stopped only yards away from us. I could hardly believe it, but I was staring at a Bigfoot. An angry, pugnacious, bellicose male Bigfoot who was eyeing the man with a furious, enraged look on his face through a pair of dark eyes that gave off a menacing orange-red eyeshine. I know it sounds completely crazy, but this creature knew exactly what was going on. He glanced at me for a single moment with protective dark eyes that registered deep concern. I knew this outlandish creature had my back. For some reason he had sensed that this man intended to kill me. Of that I am in no doubt. While me and Ashton had been fishing during the day, I had felt certain I was being stalked. I now believe that this Bigfoot had been stalking the stalker, who had been stalking me, and he clearly sensed that he was up to no good. Even though it was dark, the Bigfoot's features were somewhat obscured. I could still see that it had long flowing hair that swathed his body, and it was black. His body was absolutely massive, substantial in size, easily as large as a refrigerator. He possessed overlong arms, a pyramid-shaped head, similar to the primate species. But everything about him was so remarkably human. His face was like that of a man. I was not even a teensy-weensy bit afraid of him, although I know I should have been based on his huge Goliath size. But the brief shielding look he gave me affirmed to me that he had my back. The Bigfoot bounded towards the terrified man, whose eyes were as wide as saucers. With trembling fingers that shuddered and quivered, he fired out at the creature, but his bullets missed. The next thing I knew was that the man was flung into the air like a ball, while his revolver was discharged out of his hands, disappearing into the undergrowth. The Bigfoot caught the man in his arms, then released his hold so that the man landed gently on the earthen floor. The Bigfoot growled at the man, baring a full jaw of glistening white teeth, leering into the man's terrified eyes. Then he slapped him across the head hard with his oversized hand. The man's eyes rolled in the back of his head. The pupils grew white. He passed out, but he most certainly wasn't dead. The Bigfoot had clearly spared him. The Bigfoot looked at me in the eyes with such a look of genuine concern. He then glided towards the trees to make his escape. It looked like he was floating away as he moved. My heart was filled with wondrous awe, for in my eyes this Bigfoot coming to my rescue was like an angel sent directly from God. To cut a long story short, the man who'd been knocked out by a Bigfoot made a full recovery after the ambulance was called, and he was taken to hospital with just a mild concussion. Ashton went to speak to him personally in hospital to cut him a deal, so that of course he wouldn't get into trouble. Thankfully he agreed to testify against Luca Deville, whom he told the police had hired him to stalk me in the hope that I would be intimidated to get an abortion, but failing that, he was then asked to kill me. I gather he was planning to creep into the tent that night to blow my brains out, but he thought he got lucky when I left the tent to answer a call of nature. I'm glad to inform you that Luca Deville was arrested and ended up serving life imprisonment. Ashton's story. I awoke to the telephone ringing off the hook at 2 o'clock in the morning, a week after our tumultuous camping holiday near Mount Hood. I awoke with a start, feelings of nausea rising up in the back of my throat. What now, I thought? Who's phoning me at this God-forsaken hour? "It's me," came Beryl's voice at the other end of the line. I grew alarmed. My jaw tightened, my body visibly stiffened. "Is everything all right, Beryl?" No, it's not. I'm sorry, Ashton. I know you only see me as a friend, but I love you. I'm phoning to tell you this because I'm too scared to tell you to your face." "Well, that's a jolly good thing, because I love you too." All I could hear at the other end of the phone was choking sobs. I thought you just wanted to be my friend. You never gave me the impression that you liked me in a romantic way." "Of course I want to be your friend, but I'd like to be a lot more than that, which is why I'm so protective of you. Why would I have hung around you all this time if I just wanted to be your friend, you silly little minx?" As you can imagine, when Beryl realised that I was a wealthy, self-made millionaire, she was more than a little shaken. "I don't understand," she gulped in amazement as I took her around my lakefront home. Why didn't you say anything? I thought you had a mediocre salary, a humdrum job, a dodgy bachelor pad on the rough end of town. But this, I never imagined you'd have all this. That's what I wanted you to think, I said, taking her into my arms lovingly. I wanted to be absolutely sure that you loved me for myself alone, and not my money. That all happened a long time ago. Me and Beryl are happily married, while many of the wealthy people I know are not doing so well in the love stakes. Soon after this event, Beryl gave birth to a beautiful baby girl, and we went on to have 3 more children together, all whom left home a long time ago, to have children of their own. Beryl is so grateful for the Bigfoot that saved her life, and we are now so very happily married. She said to me, "They really are the guardians of the forest that weed out the bad seed. They can read people's intentions and minds like a book. They can see into your very heart." I believe she may well be right. So there you are. That's my story.
Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, it was a velvety black night, made significantly brighter by an almost full luminescent moon, along with a scattering of silvery stars that glittered, sparkled, twinkled like tiny gems in the vast sprawling canopy above our heads, while the cheerful music of the night filled our ears, from the chirps of the crickets, the croaks of the frogs, the occasional hoot of an owl. In the far distance, the howls of a lone wolf or coyote could be heard from a long way away, while the mysterious ethereal sounds of the night would leave you wondering, second-guessing, what was that? It was like the night enveloped me in a cosy, snug, reassuring blanket, filling me with those quintessential, cosy, nostalgic, wholesome feelings of being one with the natural world. To make matters even better, we were sitting around a fireside on timber logs that were over 100 years old, that had been designed into really cool-looking chairs by the skilled sculptural hands of my grandfather, a masterful carpenter or artist, but certainly not by profession. You could say it was more like a lifelong hobby for him. He could miraculously turn a piece of timber into an absolute masterpiece, and many items of his work were sold in contemporary art galleries across America, and were highly sought after by people with eclectic, avant-garde, innovative tastes who appreciated bringing the outside in. The fire crackled, spittered, spluttered, hissed and sizzled, the wooden pieces of timber glowing a vibrant orangey red, as the rambunctious flames danced exuberantly in the fire, while the aromatic wood smoke permeated the air with a pleasing bouquet that reminded me so much of barbecue chicken and sticky spare ribs cooking on burning hot coals. On this provocatively romantic but mellow, enchanting evening, all eyes remained fixed on the flames, as if locked in a hypnotic trance. The gentle, cool breeze blew against the flames, energizing their efficiency, so that the fire swayed and swaggered like an inebriated drunk, as the flames that engulfed the dried timber became ever brighter, taller, higher, wider, against the feisty wind, which, even though on the rather gentle side, had certainly hastened and dragooned its furious burn. At the end of my long fork, my white marshmallow began to caramelize. I pulled it away, removing the squishy, softened candy from the end of the fork, popping it into my mouth. It sizzled on the end of my tongue, melting like butter, infusing my appreciative taste buds with its sweet taste of burnt caramel. I reached for another marshmallow. This was addictive. I had greedily already eaten over a dozen, but then who was counting? If my busybody mother had been around, she'd have given me a firm slap on the wrist and told me to stop being so gluttonous. I could hear her scolding voice right now, droning in my head like a frenzied bee. "If you eat so much sugar, Russell, you'll end up like your Uncle Joe. Now, we wouldn't want that to happen to you, would we?" she would say to me in a condescending voice. My Uncle Joe was terribly fat. Much like a lovable walrus on a sandy beach, he struggled to manoeuvre his voluptuously expansive blubbery girth around our house, getting precariously caught up in doors and toilet cubicles on which his body often became unstuck. My mother had little sympathy for her brother, but now that he was under her strict thumb, as he'd moved in with us against his wise judgment, he was dropping weight faster than water, so no one would need extremes like bariatric surgery,
under my mother's watch, as she would literally glare at you with furiously offended eyes if you dared even consider a second helping of dessert. Heaven help you if you challenged her in this regard. My mother was a woman of extremes, taking things beyond the reasonable. She'd even put a lock on our refrigerator to prevent Uncle Joe from succumbing to temptation. I felt very sorry for him, as now that he was living with us under his doctor's advice, his days of sneaking trips to Wendy's, Burger King, McDonald's, Taco Bell and Subway were well and truly over. He looked so miserable, poor man. "If you don't nip your sweet tooth in the bud, Russell," my mother would say to me, "you'll end up just like him." I hardly think so, I would say. Uncle Joe ate enough food to sink the Titanic. Besides, he doesn't even have a sweet tooth. He's addicted to burgers and pizza. We were in the open yard outside my grandfather's rustic Montana farmhouse, where he had sold off most of the surrounding property to an affluent farmer, with a crop rotation system of wheat, corn and soya beans, as he'd reached his retirement years, so managing a huge farm would be all-consuming for him. Needless to say, he was very fortunate to be able to keep the illustrious 3-story white colonial farmhouse, painstakingly built from brick and wood, with its minimalistic rectangular shape that had graced our family line for many generations. My grandfather kept a small manageable piece of land that surrounded the farmhouse just for himself, with a stable block, a barn and an open garage to store his multiple farming gadgets, along with his old-world knickknacks that he couldn't bring himself to sell, as over the years he'd grown attached to some of them. They may have been obsolete, and many of them looked so retrograde and archaic, as if they belonged more in an agricultural museum, like an old plough made from wood with metal bolts, an ancient relic from the 1800s, I was told. A vintage classic horse-drawn machine to an ancient thresher that had snorted out vast spirals of black smoke in the Montana fields to bring about better harvests in those bygone days that were possibly used by long-since deceased members of the Murray family. My grandfather Hamish was equally as much a part of this land as the flowering meadows that surrounded it, the logpole pines, larches, hemlocks and ponderosas that flanked the land on the right-hand side of the valley. He was now in his early 80s, sporting a full head of windswept white hair, along with a stylish Van Dyke beard, which he manicured regularly to perfection like an old garden hedge, keeping it in tip-top, immaculate, pristine condition. He possessed these piercing blue eyes that sparkled with merriment and humour, eyes that had seen so much in his 85 years of life, from the early introduction of television to the sweeping technologies of cell phones and tablets, something that my Gramps could never ever get his head around. "I don't understand all this technology," he would complain. "I mean, I ask you, what on earth is wrong with a simple household telephone and television set? It's beyond me why people need all these fancy high-tech gadgets these days. If you ask me, the world has become far too complicated and a lot less happy with it. What is wrong with simplicity? It does make life so much easier." My mother told me that when he was a young man he was the town heartthrob. He was tall, dark and handsome in those days, but always charismatic, and this endearing quality had not changed over the years. It was his dry sense of humour, quick wit and teasing manner that had gladdened the heart of many a fair maiden back in his day. We loved coming to stay with my grandfather, all 3 of us, which included my sister Candace, who was 8, my brother Gus, who was 10, and me, of course. I was the oldest at 12. Sadly, my grandmother had died long before we were born, so we had never known her, but by all accounts she had been an extraordinary woman, whom my grandfather described as irreplaceable. After her death, my grandfather had continued to run his farm seamlessly, but now he'd chosen to retire, simply refusing to be parted from the home that had belonged to his family for generations. To all intents and purposes, he was not about to sell off something that meant so much to him, something that was under his skin, in his bones, and in the very breath of his soul. As he had so eloquently put it to my mother, "I was born on this land. I played on it as a young boy. I worked and ploughed the soil as a young man. And when I wither and die like a wild flower in the field, I want to become one with this land." And that was final as far as he was concerned. If there were any displeased faint whispers, disgruntled rumblings, or distant murmured suggestions of retirement homes looming on the horizon. Those innuendos and imputations were quickly quashed, as my grandfather wasn't having any of it, and quite rightly so. "Gramps," asked my sister Candace, "do you have a scary story to tell us? Please, I love scary stories." I'm not sure this was entirely true, as when Candace heard a scary story of any kind, she was always unable to get to sleep. My mother would awaken to her frantic, discomposed screams during the night, where she boldly informed my mother that the monster in the scary story was under the bed now and about to eat her up. In the end, she would spend the rest of the night in my parents' bed, simply refusing to return to her own bedroom. All eyes focused attentively on my grandfather, as he was an absolutely fabulous storyteller, having grown up in a generation where storytelling was an art form, as eager families impatiently gathered together around an open fire, with hearts thumping with excitement, eyes solicitously focused in a voracious expectation on the family elder, as stories, tales, fables, and legends from American folklore were revealed to a gripping, impassioned audience. So invariably my grandfather's stories overshadowed any of my mother's books that she read us, about an angry caterpillar or a very disgruntled snapping turtle, for they seemed insipid, dull, bland, wishy-washy by comparison. My grandfather's stories were colourful, and over the years he'd told us many, but the best part of his stories was that they were all true. My grandfather's face gleamed under the light of the dancing fire, while his cornflower blue eyes twinkled. He was hesitant for a moment, his face twitching awkwardly, his jaw tightening, as if he was struggling with the conundrum of whether to share a story with us or not. I knew at once he had a story to tell. I was determined he would share it with us, even if I had to drag it out of him myself. "Please, Gramps," I begged. "Please, please tell us your story." My grandfather reached for a cigar from the upper pocket of his blue plaid jacket. I watched him remove the cellophane packaging as he popped the cigar into the edge of his mouth, which he then lit. He took in a huge puff, blowing out some wispy smoke from his mouth, releasing a huge sigh, as the smoke infused the atmosphere with an aromatic smell. "Oh, that is good. Very good. You want a story? Very well, I will tell you a story, and a good one too. But I worry your mother won't be very happy with me for sharing this with you. I'm very worried, Candace, that you might find it rather scary. I'm worried you might get nightmares." "No, I won't. I'm bigger now, Gramps, much bigger than I was before, and I can even sleep with the light off," she boasted. "Very well," my Gramps reluctantly agreed. "I'll tell you a story. It's about something that happened to me and my brother on this ranch when we were about your age at the time. I was probably about 11. "It happened here?" I asked excitedly. "Here on your ranch?" "Not exactly," said my Gramps, using his cigar to gesture towards the woods. "It happened over there." He looked at us for a moment and became very still. "There are things out there, things living in those woods that you can't even begin to imagine. There was a time that I would make fun of people who believed in fairies and elves, ghosts and anomalous creatures. But now I'm not so sure. I have an open mind these days to anything that people may say that they've seen, based on what I saw that spring day, on what seems like 100 years ago now." I sat at the edge of my seat, feeling the excitement welling up in my chest. What was my grandfather going to tell me? This was a story I wanted to hear. My two younger siblings seemed equally as enthralled. The marshmallow roasting had lost its appeal, had stopped and subsided. So apart from the crackling fire, all was very still, as we hung on to our Gramps' words with bated breath. "It was early spring," said my grandfather. "A rarely fine time of year, after a very cold winter. Me and my brother Austin decided to go exploring in the woods. We always enjoyed playing in the woods. Something about the tall, statuesque trees, the indigenous animals, the pretty, beguiling creek. It always engaged our attention. We decided to build a really rough shelter for ourselves, using fallen pieces of timber. I suppose, even at that young, tender age, I had a propensity to make things. So we were industriously creating our own little secret shelter, a place where we could play card games together, Monopoly, read books, eat our lunch al fresco. We put our noses to the grindstone as we sedulously built our shelter against a large tree, overlooking the pretty views of the creek, where you could hear the rushing sound of the water gurgling over the rocks. It was a peaceful, idyllic and tranquil spot. I'm not sure you know it, do you, boys? I nodded. The creek's amazing, Gramps. I get why you liked it so much. I wouldn't mind building a shelter there myself one day. My grandfather continued. All of a sudden, in the midst of our assiduous building project, if you like, I heard a low, deep, guttural growl. I thought I'd imagined it, but one brief, perfunctory glance at my brother, I knew he'd heard it too. We sagaciously glanced around us from left to right, but saw nothing, so we continued with our project in earnest. All at once, a loud crack of a tree branch above our heads forced us to crane our heads upwards into the tree line, where we found ourselves staring into the savage red eyes of a ferocious monster, who was standing on the open branch, balancing there precariously, as if he was surfing an ocean wave at sea. The branch was struggling to support his weight, for this fellow was easily 300 pounds, and it was cracking. I was astonished. For a moment I doubted what I was actually seeing. It seemed so incongruous with our natural environment. But after a second glance, I knew this was no insidious trick of the light, but boy, did I wish it was. This thing, it was real. It continuously leered at us, with an expression upon its face of malignant malevolence, stretching back its lips to expose a full jaw of jagged canine teeth, while an invidious growl radiated from the back of its throat in a low, guttural rumble. This hideous thing was tall, willowy, powerfully strong, with a humanoid-shaped body, covered in long, sleek, dense black hair, clawed hands with talons on both hands and feet. The face on this creature was like a Rottweiler dog. Its skull was prelate and slender, with a light, thin framework resembling a triangle on equal sides with blunt angles that formed a short muzzle. I also discerned it had a long, wispy tail. But what the heck was it? I couldn't fathom, for it seemed half man and half wolf, or half man and half dog. In truth, I couldn't decide which. Everything about this hideous, grotesque creature's demeanour was misanthropic and hostile. I was so frightened that I actually wet myself. I could feel the water dribbling down my legs, and felt very embarrassed, but that was the last of my considerations. I just remember saying to myself, "Oh my God! Oh my God! What is that?" My heart began to thump in my chest so fast, while my breathing sharpened and intensified. I heard a screaming sound filtering through the forest, and I wondered who was making such a god-awful, ear-piercing commotion. And that was when I realized, to my astounding astonishment, that it was actually me. I was the one screaming at the top of my lungs, while my brother was whimpering like a cowering dog. Everything about this beast was heinously evil, guilefully duplicitous. There wasn't a doubt in my mind that this creature was exceedingly intelligent. I was unequivocally aware about one thing. It wanted blood. It wanted our blood.
"Do you think it wanted to eat you, Gramps?" asked Candace.
It wanted to kill us, more based on its abhorrent loathing it possessed towards us, rather than having an easy meal. My knees at the time were buckling under my legs like a crotchety camping chair. This thing glared at us with blazing red hostile eyes, making us astutely aware that we were both in real perilous danger. I could feel, taste, smell, sense danger with every fibre of my entire being. It was like warning sirens were screaming in my head, yelling at me to run and run for my life. The rumble in the back of its throat deepened, so that it seemed like in any second the creature would lash out and strike. I screamed at my brother. "Run!" I cried. "Run! Run!" I could hear the creature bounce off the branch of the tree, landing on the ground so gently, with a similar buoyancy and resilience to your household tabby. I was struggling to run. The terror consumed me, making my legs feel as though they were weighted down by concrete blocks. But I broke through those hindrances with a steely grit and determination that seemed to finally fire up my legs into motion. But the next thing I knew was this thing had seized me by my arm, prostrated me to the ground, where his body pounced upon me like a lion over a deer. He straddled me with his human-like legs and streamlined torso, launching down upon me with his weight, while he bit my neck. I could feel the sharp incisors tearing into my flesh. I remember thinking, so this is what it feels like for a deer when it's attacked by a mountain lion. It was so surreal, but I will tell you something that surprised me, is that it didn't hurt at the time. Afterwards it was a very different matter, of course, as the bite became infected and inflamed, like a Komodo dragon bite. So I was on antibiotics for a long while, causing me no end of grief and a whole lot of pain. My Gramps pulled back his plaid shirt to show us a deep-pitted, sunken, jagged scar on the right-hand side of his neck. I could hardly believe it. "Is that it?" I gasped, running my hand, marvelling the scar. "Is that where he bit you?" My Gramps nodded. "It's a beauty, a real war wound." My grandfather chuckled. I was crying. "No, please! No, please! Someone help!" My brother was screaming, throwing rocks at the creature, which was exceedingly brave of him. He could have easily just hightailed it back to the house, saving his own skin. But my brother was a brave boy. His hazel eyes were filling with tears. He was begging the creature, "Please leave my brother alone! Leave my brother alone!" My brother threw anything he could get his hands on at the creature, from driftwood to stones, anything. The humanoid dog was growling at him warningly, so much so that it nearly left me in order to chase after my poor brother. I was certain I was about to die, but I put up a big fight, oscillating my arms and legs, trying desperately to wiggle my way out of his firm, powerful clutches. But alas, I was completely submersed under his weight, as I was about 70 pounds at the time, and he was easily 300 pounds or more. All of a sudden I could hear this huge roar, accompanied by the chaotic, earth-shattering sound of thunderous feet pounding across the forest floor as everything vibrated and boomed, while branches snapped and cracked. In a trice, the monster that had attacked me was being pulled off my body, like a rose beetle from a rose, by something a hell of a lot bigger than he was. But what? That was the question. What? And that was when I saw her. Nothing in my wildest dreams prepared me for what I was seeing. This thing, which I now know to be a Bigfoot, was covered in long, flowing white hair. She was absolutely enormous. This dog-like humanoid didn't stand a chance against her. I scrambled hastily to my feet, but I couldn't run away. I was mesmerized, transfixed by the sight of these two powerful creatures engaging in a fight. It was an aggressive altercation, a warmongering fight, like watching two pugnacious pit bull terriers tearing into each other's flesh, fighting to the death. Only a hell of a lot more fearsome than that. for this dog-like humanoid put up an assaultive fight against the white-haired Bigfoot, which made a pit bull attack seem positively like a walk in the park or a cool breeze. I remember his powerful razor-sharp claws were lashing out fiercely at her, but they kept getting tangled up in her long hair. He kept making snapping noises with his mouth as he tried to get his teeth into her flesh, but her hair was always in the way. He was getting mouthfuls of it. This white Bigfoot held him down to the ground with an overlong arm, straddling him down with her hefty legs, sitting directly on top of him, crushing him under her sizable weight, as I could hear him groaning in agony. But I didn't feel an ounce of pity for this fractious beast, not an ounce. She glanced up at me, pointed to a stone, which was very heavy, but I managed to pick it up and brought it over to her side, feeling reasonably confident and assured that she was going to kill this nasty thing for us. I was not disappointed, or rather, me and my brother Austin were not disappointed. With her overlong arm using brute force, she bludgeoned his head as if pounding lemongrass with a pestle and mortar. I heard a moan, "Oh!" and then there was nothing but silence. Beautiful, beautiful silence. But the Bigfoot continued to hammer, crush, wallop away at the head of this humanoid dog, long after it was dead. I could see she was furious with it, as if she was acquainted with the likes of him, and despised him to her very core. I noticed there was nothing left of the obliterated skull, but just a pulverized mush of dark brown fur, brain matter, blood and goo. A grisly sight indeed, and not for sensitive eyes, I can assure you of that. The white Bigfoot studied us through her kind, deep-set dark eyes, and we were very struck by how human she appeared. Her face looked like a woman, weathered by the elements. Her brow was heavily furrowed with wrinkles. Her deep skin was almost a leathery salmon pink colour. I would say she was about 9 foot tall, 3 foot wide across the shoulders, possibly 900 pounds. Solid, burly, as heavy as a piece of farming machinery, covered with hair similar in colour to a polar bear. Actually, it really was quite beautiful. It gave her a ghostly, ethereal quality. It was long and flowing, but much more like human hair, and quite dense except on her knees, on her palms, and on her breasts. She glanced up at us. It was as if she was saying, "Are you all right?" My brother got the very same impression that this is indeed what she was saying. I was definitely struck by her intelligence and her genuine compassion. I'm in no doubt that she was watching over us with a mother's protective instinct. We both said, "Thank you, thank you." I'm certain she sensed our gratitude. She nodded, grabbed the strange dog-like humanoid, thrust his limp body over her shoulders like a huge sack of potatoes, and was gone from our sight. But when she moved away, it was like she floated on air. She was so graceful. For weeks, me and my brother were terrified to go back into the woods, in case we should encounter one of those hideous dog-like humanoids again. As if we'd seen one, maybe there were more. In the end, it was Austin that made me see sense. He said if the white hairy lady was still out there, then we could always be safe when we were in the woods, because she would have our backs, and nothing would be able to defeat her in a fight or an attack of any kind. It seemed he was right, as we resumed our play in the woods, having no trouble at all. We even got the impression we were being watched, but we sensed it was the white lady, making absolutely sure we were both safe. "What did your mother say about the bites on your neck?" "Well, she was mortified naturally, but when we told both our parents our far-fetched story, they found it too incredulous to actually believe. I heard my mother whispering to my dad, 'I think they've encountered a bear.' Our story seemed too nonsensical to even fathom, so I guess they just didn't buy it. Yet it was very clear that I'd been bitten by something quite substantial, with a very filthy mouth, based on the level of infection I acquired. Did you ever see the white Bigfoot again? As it happens, we did. It would seem one of the farmhands had lit a cigarette, failed to stub it out, which on a farm is not the wisest thing to do, as anyone will tell you. My grandfather was always warning him about it. If you continue not to stub out your cigarettes after you've smoked, you could set my farm alight. It's a very dangerous habit. He warned the man, who was indifferent to my grandfather's complaints. I remember one night when I was lying fast asleep in bed, I awoke with a start to hear our house was being heavily pelted, not by rain, but with showers of inoffensive stones. My father was grumbling, "What the heck is that?" as he climbed out of his bed. We were all looking out of the window to see who it was that was throwing stones at our house, but it was dark outside, difficult to see anything. I leaned out of my window, and that was when I saw a flash of white. It was the white Bigfoot. She pointed to me and towards the horse stables, and that was when I saw the fire rising up in the distance and smelt the billowing black smoke. I shouted, "Mum! Mum! Dad! Dad! The stables are on fire! The stables are on fire! The horses! The horses!" I could hear my father mumbling angrily under his breath, "Bloody hell! I knew that man would set fire to those stables some day, and he's gone and done it." We all dashed out of the house towards the stables, fearing the very worst. We were certain the horses could not have survived that fire. We were filled with nauseous feelings of impending dread. I remember we stood around the stables, watching the roaring flames whizzing into the air. No one said a single word. It was very quiet, as tears filled our eyes. We knew that 15 of our horses were almost certainly dead. The entire stable block was engulfed in flames. My mother was sobbing because her favourite beloved horse, Brigadier, was caught up in the inferno. I remember she collapsed on the ground in a kneeling position, pounding the grass with her fists. She was howling, "My baby, Brigadier! Oh, my Brigadier! Oh, my Brigadier, he's gone!" My father went to call the fire brigade, while me and my brother sobbed inconsolably, for we loved the horses very much. Then in a distant meadow we heard the whinnies of our horses and ran over to the meadow, and all 15 of them were there. Granted, they were shaken, but no worse for wear. That was when I realised that the white Bigfoot had rescued all those horses, saved their lives from the stable, probably broken down the door before it became engulfed in this inferno. She was the one that alerted us to the fire. Of course, I never told my parents about the white Bigfoot, but I told my brother, as he, I knew, would believe me. My brother said, "Didn't I tell you she's looking out for us?" We chose to call the Bigfoot Moon Dancer, because she was the colour of the moon, and when she ran, she looked like she was floating on air. She was so graceful. "Wow! That's an incredible story, Gramps. Do you think she might still be around today?" My Gramps shrugged. "I hope so, but she would be very old now, no doubt about it. She was a magnificent creature who saved all those horses, put a stop to a dreadful fire that could have got seriously out of hand and possibly even burnt down the farmhouse. Suffice to say, my father sacked the farmhand the following day. 'You nearly killed my horses. I want you off my land right now, and if I don't see you ever again, it'll be too soon.' 'I'm sorry, sir,' he'd said. 'Give me a second chance. I won't ever smoke again, I promise. I'll put all my stubs out from now on.' 'I can't trust you. 15 of my horses nearly died last night because of your apathetic, nonchalant attitude.' It was then that my father rightly began to ponder as to how the horses managed to escape that dreadful inferno, How had they got out of the stable? And who had pelted our home with stones to alert us to the dangers of the fire? That was something that rarely bothered him for a long time. It was a huge conundrum for him. My mother, being very religious, believed God had sent an angel to save the horses, which I suppose you could say he did, in a manner of speaking. So your parents never did see the white Bigfoot, then? Well, no, not on that occasion, said my Gramps, taking another puff of his pipe. But my mother did see her once, he said, a huge smile bursting onto his face. My mother had taken our poodle out to do its business in the middle of the night. The next thing we knew, my mother let out this most god-awful scream that vibrated through the entire house like an ear-piercing ambulance siren. Everyone dashed down the stairs, thinking that something quite terrible had happened. My mother continued to scream, even when she was in the kitchen. She just wouldn't stop. She was like a trilling, annoying alarm clock that you could never switch off unless you broke it. So my father slapped her across the face, something he'd never done before or since, but he had to stop her from screaming. "What the heck is wrong, Sonia?" My mother stopped screaming, but her eyes grew wide and she began to tremble. I've seen a ghost! I've just seen a ghost!" "What?" "I told you! I've seen a ghost!" At this my father looked confounded. "Where did you see this ghost?" My mother trembled, her whole body wobbling like a jelly. I was taking Pixie for her pee. Then I saw it floating across the lawn. It was big, hairy. It looked directly at me. The ghost, it looked at me," she said, her eyes growing ever rounder. And then it floated into the woods. It was the scariest thing I've ever seen in my life." "You poor, poor thing," said my father, cradling my mother in his arms. "You've had a nasty shock." Of course, me and my brother burst out laughing, as we realised my mother had seen Moondancer. Of course, our sniggers went down with my parents like a lead balloon. "You boys should be ashamed of yourself," said my father, "laughing at your mother like this, when she's had the fright of her life." "But Dad, she didn't see a ghost," I protested. "How dare you, son? Such insolence! You disappoint me. If your mother says she saw a ghost, she saw a ghost. Do you hear me?" But Dad..." "No buts, son. You and your brother. Your insolence I've had enough. You go to bed right now. Do you hear me?" We dutifully obeyed. My mother went to her grave believing she'd seen a ghost. I promise you there wasn't a dinner party that she didn't host where she did not reveal her strange encounter with a white hairy ghost. All her guests were delighted in hearing her account again and again and again. That became exceedingly exaggerated over the years. To cut a long story short, me and my brother were blown away by the story my grandfather shared with us. But of course, as we expected, Candace was beginning to have nightmares at night as a result of my grandfather's story. So my mother came down on him like a ton of bricks. "What are you doing, filling my children's heads with outlandish stories? Candace can't get to sleep at night because of you. I hope you're happy with yourself, Dad. Do you have no understanding of children? Why can't you read them decent books that are safe, like The Angry Caterpillar or The Snapping Turtle? That's what a kid wants to hear. Not monstrous human dogs galloping through woods attacking children." My mother was wrong about that, because the story my grandfather told me was the most incredible story I've ever heard. So there you are. That's my story.
Well, hello there. I hope you enjoyed the Omnibus edition. We've got many more coming our way for you to listen to. Sending you love wherever you are in the world, in North America, Canada, Kenya, wherever you may be. I send you lots and lots of love. Thank you for listening to my Omnibus, and I really do hope you enjoyed it, because that's the whole idea about it, is to give you some interesting stories to listen to. So until next time, goodbye and good night.